All right, and we are back with another episode. I just saw like my thing muted while I was going through that. It seems like StreamYard is having some technical difficulties. I logged in and it was like your subscription is going to end in 27,432 days or something like that. Like, but don't worry, it was like a very weird notification. So they're having a little bit of issues, but we will forge ahead. I don't see it being a problem, especially now that Trump has won the election. Everything is awesome and we are on the best timeline. But I am very excited to be joined by Helot of Defense Distributed. He's going to be talking a little bit about that company. We're going to talk a little bit about the election. We're going to talk about business in as it's been and where it's going for our guys and what that looks like. So I am very excited to have you on. Welcome to the MetaCast, sir.
Howdy doody.
Yeah, it was great getting to meet you not so long ago, and it's every time I meet one of our guys, I'm always very kind of impressed. They're always like articulate, down to earth, relaxed. You can pick up the vibe pretty quick, and so it was an absolute pleasure, and to see all the stuff you guys have been doing, and so I'm pretty excited. But I do want to kind of kick it off with asking you. I'm sure the last 24 hours have been just as much fun for you as they have been for me. How have you been spending your election night and day after?
Well, I had a bunch of guys I was hanging out with, good Catholic friends, like 20 of us, to sit down for the election. And I mean, the election overall is fairly boring. You're just waiting for numbers to kind of
Yeah.
parse through, and you hope that things are going to go well. And everyone had the same thought, which was like, well, Trump will win if they don't steal it, which is what everyone should have been thinking in
Yeah.
2020. But and it was really good. It was really funny. The vibes have changed in normal politeness. So I'm a
Mm.
Catholic convert, probably 10 years ago, ongoing. And I've been involved with
Mhm.
like local scenes and youth groups and all that sort of stuff, like talking with people all the time and getting a sense of the vibe. And I've always been the most extreme radical of everyone, and not in the political sense, but just sort of
Yeah.
any sense. If I'm saying something, it's like a meme. People have like catchphrases and word books and attitudes. If there's a radical position, this guy's going to have it. And the weirdest thing with all these guys was everyone is ultra radicalized. There was this like black fella that I've known for years, who I always thought was a shitlib, and he's like introducing us to Fuentes. Like he was suddenly super into it. One guy did like a Trump impression and dropped the hard R, and half the party, that was a vibe check, but the other half of us were just giggling. Like it was very, very intensive. Like the whole scene of what people think is normal and appropriate has gone into a much more aggressive direction.
No, that's awesome to hear, right? This is something. It's funny. I wrote a article about this. I want to say this is like almost a year, if not more, ago now, and it was basically saying, look, we are winning. Our ideas are winning. People want to be able to say the hard R and do all the crazy stuff now. And don't get me wrong. I think like just being spicy for no value is a little silly. Like it's still a good filter. It's still a good way to get to know people and all this kind of stuff. But us winning has this problem of like, how do you start sorting people out, right? How do you start differentiating, quality people from not quality people? Because the filter was, if you were kind of on this wavelength, then you did so despite great opposition, right? You became based despite all of the pressure in society to make you, a libtarded soy jack. And so you could feel pretty confident that the other based guys, like, they were like authentically based. But now I do think that with Trump winning and all of this energy coming into the movement, you see a lot of people who are like pro Trump, or they'll say things like based bro, and you're like, well, are you, like, what have you actually done? What are your first principles? Are you just here for the scene versus the actual thing? And so it's going to be interesting. Like, I think winning is great, but I also think it presents us some interesting problems that we haven't been thinking about, we haven't been accounting for. So yeah, I don't know.
What kind of American are you?
Yeah, exactly. I think, the next thing that's going to differentiate us is between the guys who are just kind of enjoying the scene, and those who are building. And obviously, defense distributed, you guys are doing a lot of really cool stuff. Do you want to kind of introduce that, for anyone who doesn't know? Because to be honest, before we ended up running into each other, I think I had like heard bits and pieces here and there, but I hadn't heard too much of the story, and so I am pretty curious to kind of hear a little bit of the background to whatever degree you're willing to share it.
Yeah, the general log line for Defense Distributed is it's the private defense contractor for the public good. And its initial
Like it.
project, which everyone is relatively familiar with, even most normies are very familiar with it. About 10 years ago, Cody Wilson, a law student around the UT area, University of Texas in Austin, he released a set of files on the internet which allowed somebody to take a common FDM 3D printer, a fused deposition system, and manufacture a firearm at home. And it would use a
Hmm.
relatively small caliber, and it probably wouldn't, survive the single shot it was doing. But it was kind of inspired by the World War II dropping of the U.S. military's Liberator, which was a sheet metal single shot firearm that was meant for a local population that were in rebellion against the Germans to be able to kill a soldier and get that soldier's weapon and then do whatever they're going to do with it. So it's kind of a propaganda weapon. And the same way happened with this 3D printed weapon, where the nascent maker movement, and there's always been a lot of fabrication and maker energy in America in the first world, but there was a particular movement around the time of Stratasys's patents on FDM 3D printing breaking, where Chinese companies were able to start manufacturing and selling cheap 3D printers. And 3D printing materials aren't necessarily the best for many use cases, but this idea of rapid prototyping at your home relatively easily and the ability to manufacture all sorts of shapes, there's a big happy shit libby energy over like, oh, we can now make fun knickknacks, and suddenly this
Hmm.
dangerous political weapon was distributed, and it wasn't distributed as a functional weapon. It was like it did function, but it wasn't like there's 15 or 16 different major criterion for when you're designing a firearm what you're looking for. This one would fail essentially all of them except maybe cost. But the big point was that you have gun control, you have this big, massive political, historical push at a regulatory level and a cybernetic level for the system to limit the ability of its citizens to be able to do anything about what it's up to. And then suddenly, with this magical piece of technology that their citizens are using to make other things, you can now produce a firearm no matter what the regulatory system states, because it's always going to attack the businesses, the firearm manufacturers. It's going to find those
Hmm.
choke points and limit those, and it's going to require everyone to, send their IDs and verify that they're allowed to own a firearm and, contain it and use it. Or especially globally, in many places where you can't even think about having a firearm, suddenly you can now print a firearm. And there's this very classic illustration of kids in Spain. The libraries, like most libraries now, engage in funny side projects. And one of their funny side projects was having some printers. And these kids were just printing off Liberators like, it was the end of the world. And so Spain suddenly has this problem of, oh, this technology has now negated our political capacity to control these human beings. So that was like the
Hmm.
very first like stage of things. And then there were other secondary printable options that were experimented with, like the printing of AR-15 magazines, the classic American rifle, and the printing of AR-15 low receivers. A development in firearm manufacture in the past like 60 or 70 years is a move from like boutique, specialized systems and like underlying components that are only for a singular type of firearm and can't really be manipulated easily without a gunsmith, to modular systems. And so the AR-15 and the Glock, and I guess some of the SIG stuff from the recent military pistol and rifle changes, there's this tendency to be able to take different components off your gun and add mods to them. And I think like modern firearm like video games or military video games illustrate this well, although they pretend that firearms that are easily moddable that aren't really easily moddable, like a lot of AK platforms. But yeah, you can modify your firearm, replace different components, and you get this ship of Theseus moment of like, well, which component actually constitutes the firearm itself? And in the 80s, the greater industrial manufacturing basis of this country was having to engage with contract labor. And when you're making firearms, there is this moment of if I'm Remington and I have all the legal stuff squared away, but I contract out elements of my fabrication to other entities, to what degree do they require, FFLs or other regulatory overhead to manufacture these subcomponents? So the ATF actually generated this conceptual framework to figure out what was the component in most firearms that's the legally defined component. Once this was accomplished, most firearms in this country have this associated component, and with the AR-15, it's known as the lower receiver. It's the component that stacks the upper receiver, which is usually the barrel assembly, like where the bullet goes out and where the bolt usually sits, and how the extractor, how the bullet is removed, and all that. And so the low receiver holds that upper receiver assembly, and then the magazine goes into the lower receiver, and then the stock associates with that lower receiver, and then the fire control group, which is essentially the trigger and the trigger pack as it relates to its interaction with the bolt assembly, that sits in the low receiver. So it's essentially just sort of a little funny looking box that a lot of other Legos plug into. And that was determined to be the legal component. And one of the early projects with the Liberator was a printable version of this lower receiver. And this is important because if all the other components of a firearm outside of the lower receiver are not like federally regulated firearm components, they're just secondary firearm accessories, essentially. Even if they're integral to the function of the firearm, there just is not a lot of regulatory overhead. You're able to purchase these components even if you're a felon, and you can like have them all at your disposal. And a printable lower receiver allows you to link that all together. And printable lower receivers over the past 10 years have improved sufficiently that they're a viable component to operate with. But most of the heat and stresses that are applying in the firearm outside of the buffer tower, they don't really affect the lower receiver that much. So even the crappier early printable versions, very stable platforms for people to have access to the American rifle, which is the only way you're going to be able to interface with military LEO problems, is something like a rifle. Handguns are great, but like if you're really going to do anything, you need a rifle. So those were some of the earliest technologies that were at play. And unfortunately, the government really didn't like this at all.
I wonder why.
So they had to scramble to figure out, how do we stop this though, right? Like the internet had existed and there's different ways of regulating things on the internet, but in this particular context, it was a huge problem. And it's a huge problem globally because of the way the internet functions. And so they were trying to figure out how to limit this. And what ended up happening is the State Department became involved, and they applied ITAR export regulations. And the ITAR is really meant to deal with sending of military data to foreign powers. Like it's trying to limit what American military technologies can be distributed. And it was just applied to this general case. And it had been done before, actually. There was an attempt when RSA encryption was being distributed, like the initial like public key, private key game where you can sign emails in a manner that are encrypted for easy public consumption, PGP, and all this. And that was also a huge ITAR fight, which I think the Clinton admin ended up dropping because of like the problems it presented. But this is also the citizens' ability to hide and protect and isolate themselves from regulatory overhead, which goes in this case for the firearm. And for a very long time, there was just a conflict over that in various federal courts with the State Department, and that ended up being ameliorated. There was a small period of time where the State Department had just given Defense Distributed specifically a license to distribute these files. It wasn't more of a universal right. But it wasn't really like a win. It was kind of like just a settlement of like, well, we just don't want to fight this anymore, because otherwise they'd have to face really extreme First Amendment challenges, because this is all technical data. Like, this isn't the distribution of a firearm overseas. This is, well, how would you make this firearm? And more specifically, how would you make this firearm in a manner that's easy for a 3D printer to consume? Because you can buy a significant amount of firearm technical data free and clear. It's just usually in the forms of drawings or books or descriptions. This idea
Mm.
of a three-dimensional model mathematically collated that could be input into a 3D printer to produce a specific object, that was kind of the major fight. And the thing that undergirds all of this, which is more relevant to the conversation at hand, is going to court is expensive and terrible. And when Cody did this, he was, again, a law student at UT, like essentially nothing to his name, did just this terrible, terrible action. And yeah, when DefCAD was up early on, which was the vehicle by which the Liberator was distributed, that small period of time before the Fed shut DefCAD down initially, he was running advertisements and making an obscene amount of money. It was like $25,000 a month or something just on ads. So there was this like initial period of like, well, I've got some cash on this and I can do some R&D on it, but then they shut that stream of revenue down, and then you've got to go to court. You got to pay lawyers, you got to pay yourself. Like, your whole life is now dictated to this world historical cause. And as a result, there needed to be some technical way of producing funds that wasn't just like a charity campaign. And so the response by Cody and some of his compatriots very early on was the development of a device known as the Ghost Gunner, which is a desktop computer numerical control milling machine. And what that means is it's a manufacturing device that can work in the X, Y, and Z planes off of a base set of G code developed by MIT in, I think, the early 60s, that can just tell a machine tool where to go in space, how fast it goes to that location in space, and how fast the tool is spinning when it goes to that location in space. And so they use flat drill bits known as end mills. They're not a subset of drill bits, but the closest analog, if you've never seen one, would be a drill bit, where it's a helical cutting tool with a flat face that
Mhm.
can just cut into metal the same way you would cut into butter. It does like a very small shearing force, like very small thousandths of an inch of material are being sheared off a block of metal. And in a sense, this is the opposite of 3D printing. You're not adding plastic material, you're removing metallic material to your desired shape. And the reason for the use of this technology, which is a central fundamental fabrication technology, it's not as central as the lathe, but it's very, very close. Essentially, it was designed to clean up forged castings, which is pouring molten metal into a specific shape and then giving it sharp angles and precision faces. So the mill has always been a central element of American manufacture. The reason this device came about, beyond the Marshall McLuhan fun reversal of technology from a 3D printer, is that that same 80% lower receiver determination on the AR-15, they discovered that there was a specific point in law where that lower receiver was not a lower receiver, right? If you had halfway built a lower receiver, it still wasn't a lower receiver. So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, determined that at 80% of the way of fabrication, the lower receiver was not a lower receiver. If the entire area that the trigger group sat in was filled up, and if some of the drill holes were missing, then it was just a block of metal. It was just a paperweight. It didn't have any regulatory expression because there's no way you could readily turn it into a firearm. You had to engage in a very technical, either manual or machinic process to produce the item that you're looking for. And so this has been known for a very long time as the 80% rule. And before, Defense Distributed, there were jigs and other systems where someone could take a manual mill or other like Dremel technologies or whatever, and process out the lower receiver. But this is kind of an art and kind of irritating and kind of a whole weekend. And there just wasn't really a strong market or really an understanding that this loophole existed. It wasn't really popularized. And so the entire objective of the first Ghost Gunner was, can we take an 80% lower receiver, a component that is sold in many places, and can we develop a machine that's affordable that people can just mill out and do all the technical operations that they want on this receiver to produce the item that we desire, like to make a fully functional firearm component and to build a firearm off of it that would shoot reliably. And that was the big objective. And through, like, by hook or by crook, they accomplished it. And I did not get involved until the GG2. So the GG1 is still a mythical, legendary thing to me. But Cody made sure to make that happen and fight all the regulatory overhead. And the profits made from that procedure, either in gathered Bitcoin or whatever else, all the secondary profits went immediately back into the lawsuits, immediately against fighting the State Department, like immediately dealing with these problems because he had no other choice but to create this machine and then fight those lawsuits. So that's kind of the early era of defense distributed, which was, 7-8 years ago.
Dude, that is so cool and so crazy. I think it's almost kind of like this maybe like an analogy that might make sense is like it's like if you have a kid and you set some rules with your kid and you feel like the rules are like pretty straightforward. It's like, you can't eat outside the kitchen, right? Um and then they're like, okay, what constitutes the kitchen, right? It's like you're just like it's like inside, past the wall, like like what is the kitchen? And can I like hold the food in the kitchen and then like stand outside, like and that's kind of what you guys are doing. Like, and the reason I'm thinking of that is like there's this really funny tweet I saw not so long ago where it was like they had the rule of like you can't you can't use the internet in the kitchen and you can't eat um, outside of the kitchen. And so the kid's like eating in the kitchen and then he's got his like phone, tablet, like just outside the kitchen. Um, and like so for you guys, right? That's basically what you're doing is you're figuring out. Okay, we have this new technology that allows us to fabricate it and universalize this, which is absolutely amazing, right? Because I was listening to Elon on Rogan, on my drive back from the events this past weekend, and one of the things they're talking about is like how important free speech is and how important the Second Amendment is because that's what allows you to have free speech. Right? On a long enough timeline, you're not going to be able to guarantee that the government's always going to be able to not be tyrannical, right? And the thing that guarantees that is you have a bunch of guns. You have the ability to defend yourself, and so obviously this is a very important thing, right? It's a right that we should have. I would be curious to kind of get your thoughts on kind of the degree to which they're being ridiculous by kind of limiting our abilities, but it does democratize these things, right? It makes them widely accessible, makes them much more affordable, right? And you're basically figuring out like what is the best way that we can equip people, right? That we can allow them to express their Second Amendment right while kind of being inside the rules. And it's really freaking creative, right? Like you're finding all these like clever, you're kind of forcing them to define the rules at a very granular level and then saying, okay, how can we exploit the rules as they've defined them? Not really, well, not exploit, but like let's push it to the absolute limit of what is legal, such that we can kind of achieve this goal of uh, allowing people to exercise their Second Amendment right. So it's a really cool problem, like the way that you've talked about it, the history. Like I don't know, this is like a solid 10-15 minutes of background, and I was like wrapped the whole time. So yeah, it's pretty cool what you guys are doing. It's
Well, what's
what do you
especially fascinating, like along these fronts, is I think that your interpretation is initially how I was interpreting it from the outside, and initially a lot about it because it's much more parsable. But Cody's background in literature and law and philosophy tends to, and not really anymore, but at the time it tended a lot more to anarchistic ontologies. And so the whole focus was to attack the political norms around gun control themselves rather than try to take advantage of a particular legal precedent, because any specific legal precedent or regulatory system is bound to be changed relatively easily by the sovereign. Like that entity can just decide that that loophole does not exist and that your little fun game is silly and you shouldn't bother playing it anymore. So the bigger question was to attack the idea of democratic politics in general, which is this we have representatives and we have particular things that we vote on. And as a body politic, we determine what is right or what is wrong, what is legal or what is illegal, and how things should be operated. And the primary focus was no, this is a technical impediment for you now. Like, you cannot pretend that gun control exists in any factual sense because of the technologies that are available, especially the technologies in the past 3 or 4 years. But like at the time, it was because the gun was so shisty, it was impressive. There's like, interesting things about compliance mechanisms. Again, the whole thing's plastic. So there are spring-esque mechanisms in any given firearm for a trigger to function if it's not using an electrical fire control group like modern anti-aircraft weaponry. So it's like if you have springs, these springs are printed. Like there are a variety of interesting elements present there. But the gun is just not, you wouldn't use it for self-defense. You wouldn't use it to shoot a cop. You wouldn't use it for any potential reason that a firearm exists, to shoot an animal. Like it's just, it's very risky, especially the material science that was available for FDM 3D printing at the time. Its entire focus was a repudiation of politics, like a strong Anglo attack, like taking
Mm.
the Anglo tradition of the ownership of weaponry, which predates America by quite a bit. Um,
Oh yeah.
there's a funny aside on this though. There was a king in the Middle Ages that wanted his populace to be trained in firearms because you don't have to have a lot of experience, you don't have a lot of technical skill. He wanted everyone to have access to weapons, and he was trying to mandate once a week people would have to take their muskets out and shoot these guns. And the entire English population told him to go fuck himself. They were uninterested in pursuing that particular ability in their lives. But there's like this long standing like understanding that an Anglo population or a Proto-Indo-European population should be able to defend themselves, and like not like how that applies to even their political realities. It was the type of sword of Damocles. This has always been a big push through, and the Americans formalized it in some sense from the mutation of the Articles of Confederation to the Second Amendment, which is why the Second Amendment reads like a terrorist screed rather than a defense of like firearm ownership. It's like, no, you should gather in war bands, like for the defense of the Commonwealth, like a very, very different phrasing. So this is like the modern cyberpunk approach to that by being like, uh, you can quote laws at me, but we have swords. Like this is it doesn't matter. Like we have changed the game fundamentally from like an individual guy who wasn't speaking as a talking head. He wasn't applying a media strategy or a manipulation of consensus reality. He was manipulating technical reality.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's nothing to add to that. That is extremely well put. That is really, really freaking cool, right? This is just like nerd war, right? Like you have a bunch of like unimaginative bureaucrats, and to your point, they're like quoting laws at you, and you're just like, well, screw you. I have all this creative capability, and so I'm going to find ways to work around this and drive towards what I think is actually right. So yeah, that is really cool.
And,
Um,
and in a sense, I think Trump did something very, very similar in 2016 with the not Palantir, the what's that other group that was doing the data analysis for voting? Cambridge Analytica?
yeah, that could be right. I'm not sure.
There was a big thing in 2016, and they really, got very, very mad about it. And even though it is very deep state style technology, and LLMs came shortly thereafter in historical terms, but yet Trump himself was engaging in technical adjustments to the political process as a complete outsider. Engaging like Trump. We've been watching his stuff for years, and he's got many interviews from decades ago that are resurfacing on his opinions of politics and the presidency and all that. But this is like a media man reviewing, like if it was a TV show, what the demographics were actually interested in, and then applying like a statistical and I would say for him mostly intuitive analysis of the situation and using the technologies at play to manipulate reality to what he wanted.
No, I love that, and I think that's very much kind of core to my own ethos as far as like what should we be doing in our space as well, right? I wrote a thread not so long ago. It was on like fraternal networks, and it was basically saying, look, like there's this idea in tech of like first mover advantage, right? It's basically that there's like a new green field, and the first person in there, right, in that green field has a major advantage over all the later comers because they're going to be established, right? So if you're selling some sort of product, you're the first one selling the product, and then you become like you have brand recognition, like band-aids, right? It's just like bandages, but because the term becomes synonymous with the object, it's really hard for like anyone else to create something that's similar, right? And I think we're
Oh, like
in.
Sharpie or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you can have things like Elon is really like the first one to do electric cars really effectively and on a mass scale, right? And one of the huge advantages that affords him is he put cameras in all the Teslas, and all the Teslas have been collecting driving data, and so the amount of data that they have for self-driving, training the self-driving algorithms is just like worlds bigger than like what Google has or whatever, because they have that like one car that's driving around, right? And the point that I'm driving at here is that we similarly have a first mover advantage, but it's not in technology, it's in networks, right? You have a lot of these networks that have existed in the past, right? You have like Lions Club, or you just have local communities, or you have alumni networks, or whatever it is. And in the modern world, those networks have really fallen apart, right? They're kind of starting to degrade. They don't have the same quality that they used to, the same cohesion. There's very little like mutual ideology between the people who are still like existing in them. And one of the biggest psyops in Hollywood is this idea that like the only way that you can solve any problem is like being a lone man, up against the system, right? It's like the John Wick fallacy. And really the way to do it is through a group of people, right? Working collaboratively together. And so we have this opportunity right now to restart networks, to be kind of the first movers into this new network space, and especially because so many of us have been kind of kicked out by the system because whether it's we realized how fake and gay it was, or it pushed us out for trying to be um, you know competent and successful and trying to make things better, right? And we have this opportunity to kind of round up all these really competent people who got spit out by the system and create a really comprehensive like fraternal network, a nice strong one that's going to then put us in a position to be kind of this, I think, really like a competence elite. That especially now that Trump's in, like we have a huge opportunity to build business and to push things. And I think inside a much more favorable government. I mean, we'll see what actually really happens here, but I think the opportunity to build is extremely high, and it is it is a function of how cohesive a network, how trusting a network have you built, right, such that you can aggregate resources, knowledge, information, drive things forward. So after kind of laying that all out there, I guess I'm curious to ask how the defense distributed network kind of was started and grew. Obviously Core is like a key member in this whole story, but you want to, I don't know, to again, to whatever extent you can, kind of talk a little bit about how that team has kind of come together and what that looks like now, and what you're hoping to have that look like going forward.
Yeah, yeah, I can describe that. I'd say just as an aside on networks, it's unsurprising that the Robert Putnam bowling alone stuff happened because when you review a pre-internet system, maybe even a pre-telegraph system, but like pre-internet for sure, everyone has to live, everyone has to do things, everyone has to discover and figure out where resources flow, where connections occur, how you can make your life and engage in your life. And the like very stable value for a social species on attaining that is localized connection. But localized connection, and I'm a very extroverted person and I love being with people. So I'm really just describing this formally rather than in an antagonistic fashion. But it sucks to be around people. Like there's just a lot of disadvantages, and it's very complicated, and there's a lot of con confluences. There's a lot of things competing with each other when you're managing social affairs, and you also can't scale, which I find is okay. I have issues with scale, but like you can kind of see why people who would need to get their daily data and their daily decision making preferences informed by their external environment, why once you were able to just skip everything the same way you can kind of skip sex with internet pornography. It's not an effective replacement by any means, but it's a skip, like the highly sugar foods. Like it's a hyperstimulative skip. Once you're able to just communicate directly with people, no matter where they're at, and just discuss your own interests directly without any of this social rigmarole, it kind of makes sense why local networks would break down almost instantaneously, which is what occurred. So I don't know. I like it's just always something I like to bring up to radicals in the political space. It's like, well, this is why these systems were in place prior. This is why these people are acting rationally. And that's why with these changes, things are much, much worse than anyone knew except like Theodore Kaczynski. Like, there's very formal reasons why the liberal coercion is so pernicious and so damaging and so destructive. Like, why does the NSA have so much power over the very existence of human reality? Like most people are not aware of just how magical and insane these like conditions we're in are. As far as the defense distributed network and kind of where that went or who was involved or how that kind of grew about, shortly after the production of this first machine, the initial team that accrued over Cody Wilson and the two other primary characters that were at the center of that business were people that were involved in the Austin area, particularly around political subjects. There was a significant amount of both left and right anarchistic factions, which is very fascinating. It was very strange to me to encounter it once it was more mature. But there was this total sense where they were interested in this technical refutation. But Austin has always been weird to some degree, and there were many people that were in that kind of Ron Paul-esque energy or that Konkin-esque energy. There was some political association that was present there, and they had just gathered together to legitimately bootstrap a business. And you know, bootstrapping is something that just never happens. And like it's happened in the past, but it just doesn't happen anytime in the contemporary present. And it was, you know, even 10 years ago, you just did not see bootstrapping where a business is produced without outside capital, where it's just people have gathered together and are immediately selling a product, even if there's some pre-sale systems involved. So there's a significant amount of push on that front. I'd say overall, defense distributed actually represents one of the network failings, and it should be a cautionary tale insofar as we've stayed relatively into their whole time, and that acolytes or other individuals that are especially interested in the cause will visit or join in some fashion. There was never a branching out or gathering of other characters. And the primary failure is this recognition while funds have come in and a business has been able to be made and things are very interesting, how they can operate in those lines, it's a very limited and extremely niche business. Like, I have many friends in this town, and most of them really don't know what I do, and they don't really know the business. And I don't, you know, lecture them or discuss with them at length unless they ask for it. I'm not a jerk, but like the essential things that we're engaging on are so complex and so at the fringe. Very few people know we do. Our primary customer base are boomers that are invested in trying to manufacture firearms per these systems without putting in a lot of effort. Like it's just lazy older guys that kind of get the vibe and want to be involved. And it's such a very strange small business, and we have consistent conflicts not just in the legal space, not just at federal level lawsuits but state level lawsuits. Like there's a consistent conflict with the state, which is always draining funds, always draining energy, always draining time. But also the real power in this country, and the real power to review of like the conflicts in, you know, World War II, is the financial system. The financial system is actually where power lies. Like anyone that's ever tried to start their own business or interface in such a manner where payments need to be processed in and out, where energy flow really is happening, how you acquire and manage money, especially digital money in terms of credit debit markets, Uh, there are very specific firms that have links to powerful people at some level of resolution. And at the lower levels, they have to run checks and engagements on your business and who you are to a degree which seems dystopian and insane. Like the amount of information you have to give to financial institutions is incredible. And it makes sense. They're trying to prevent fraud and they're trying to apply a certain level of political control at the same time. And anyone that's engaged with an Indian in their whole lives recognizes the need for anti fraud measures. And so, like, when you're presented with a structure that applies anti fraud measures to politics they don't like, you suddenly realize, oh, I can't get a bank even if you're doing good on money, you're not getting chargebacks, like everything's good, everything's flowing correctly. If some individual in a specific financial institution has a political bone to pick with you, you do not get to have access to customers at all. And like cryptocurrency and these other technologies are interesting, and we've taken advantage of them from time to time. But the speculative nature of those instruments has really prevented them from achieving the ideological goals that the early Bitcoin libertarians were interested in, which was an alternative economy to, supersede from the financial institutions. Like that didn't really occur, and in fact, the financial institutions and have consumed cryptocurrencies to a significant degree, and they're making a lot of money, and good for them. But like access to actually operating as a real business when you're a gray legal entity is extraordinarily difficult, especially because you're not making the kind of money that black legal entities like drug dealers should be making. So it's like you kind of have the worst of both worlds. You're not really getting a heavy influx of cash, and you also can't interface at all with the normal business sector. And we can to some degree. We've been fighting for it the whole time. But the real lesson is you need to go back to a patronage understanding of stuff. There needs to be networks where people are making money in regular, unsexy businesses that pass fraud checks flawlessly, that operate free and clear. And then you can contract out sums of funds in a legal fashion to groups that probably wouldn't be able to make it in the free market, because these are essential political obligations that you would be trying to engage in if you're trying to use business as a way to manipulate the political. And this is what, a variety of characters have been doing for a long, long time in terms of left-wing university engagement and left-wing non-governmental organization operations. Like anything that involves like charities or 501c3s that are manipulating the political landscape, they're essentially the political version of a loss leader, the way that a corn dog or a pizza at Costco is a loss leader. It's meant to not make any money. It's just meant to make people interested in the particular framework that you exist in, which in this context is buying TVs from Costco. But in the general political sense, NGOs are used as loss leaders to normalize liberal coercion on a global scale and to manipulate politics in places that would be essentially seen as like declarations of war if direct state entities were to cause that level of manipulation. So in terms of networks, I would say the big focus is, my brother in Christ, just make some money and reward your friends and punish your enemies. Like you don't need to have some weird,
Mm.
crazy anarchist secondary niche cyberpunk business and use that as the primary leverage. Like use those things as distractions or fun little experiments, but these things do not have nearly enough resources to manipulate anything at any scale that would change the needle. It's essentially like an art project more than it is like an effective valence for the production of people's lives. And we do have a couple people here with families and things going on, but it's just so small and there's no way of scaling it. We get people that come in that want to get jobs and we can engage with them to some degree, but we can't really support a community with the funds that are operating here. And I'm talking like a Dunbar number or below community, like more than 10 people. And that would be just ridiculous given the economics at play. Like people need to think more in terms of Mondragon. You need to think in terms of like cooperative enterprise and like the ability to maintain a significant amount of human capital. Like that's just not what this operation is about and what it could feasibly deal with. But in terms of the right wing response to things, like you need to have operations that bring in a lot of money, even if the money is used effectively, like even if waste is limited, like a human being costs quite a bit of money, especially a high quality human being negotiating in specific contexts of this country. Like it's not cheap, it's not easy. So you can't just like use edgy things that are reliant on news media cycles to support like a real lived experience.
So, you're kind of making this point that for you guys, this business isn't so much about making money, right? What would you say it is about, right? Like you kind of made the point earlier that it's this kind of like middle finger kind of like, you know, you're making this point that you can't be controlled, right? And you're going to do it in a very creative way. Like as you guys move forward, what would be kind of the success metrics that you're putting out there for yourselves? Like grow the business, win some of these legal disputes, like especially, and I guess, this is a good time to kind of pull in the context of like Trump and, if this actually shifts the landscape in any meaningful way. I would assume that it does, but I'd be curious to hear kind of like given, like what are your goals? And then again, how does Trump coming in, maybe kind of make you more or less optimistic about your ability to achieve them?
Yeah, I'd say the contemporary goals that make sense are threefold. The first was what I described earlier, which is in order to fund the continual lawfare against the State Department, which has been resolved. That early Defense Distributed 1.0 situation has got a stable situation that it resolved too, but we have continual conflicts. But the initial function of the Ghost Gunner and the business that was related to, which is just ghostgunner.net, that was to pay for legal correspondence. And so, to some degree, our business interests, whether I like it or not, I'd prefer us to do more real business work. But the momentum of the company still tends towards the business as a secondary objective for the payment of legal correspondences. So that's still, I would say, primary. I'd say the secondary is investment and engagement with research and development on projects that will not turn a profit in a real sense, but will offer alternatives for the American rifleman. There's a variety of technologies in the do-it-yourself defense space that if you were to make competitive with existing firearm or other such entities, you'd have to be charging thousands of dollars to even get into the game. It gets very expensive when you're talking about atoms and the manipulation of atoms in precision industry. So the research and development that leads to the capacity for individuals to access defense technologies in a reasonable sense. That's the solid secondary objective. And the tertiary is that we're not really the only game in Austin. While the culture of Defense Distributed never really set itself up as a social culture, and there are advantages and disadvantages, but a primary disadvantage is very few people are even aware we exist in this town. And I can go out and talk to people of like related spheres who like us, who know about us, but most everyone's just, it's a ghost. Like we're just hidden. Like people are just not aware of that engagement. But we do have some connections we've made, and whenever we engage with those people, we try to share business connections or different entities we work with. We've worked with a variety of entities that have come to us to help them achieve their objectives, including fully white label enterprises. Like once they get that this is a technical enterprise with some mechanical engineering and chemical engineering acumen, they ask us questions or try to have access to suppliers we've manipulated. There's some sharing of information. So our continual goal would be helping foster anything that continues. But yeah, I think there's still this open question of what DD 2.0 is as like people get older, and like where do these games go, or what do these projects lead to? And it seems to be fostering internal development. Like we have different people on the inside that have objectives of their own that are working, with support of Cody, but not necessarily of his dream. So it's like there's sort of there's this gardening that's occurring because the enterprise has just been around for so long. And I think a huge kind of animus in the company is while there was a lot of left anarchists for a while, left anarchists just can't work. And the Peter principle was kicking in really heavy. And the Peter principle is people are promoted to the level of their incompetence. So
Hmm.
like even left anarchists that were hanging around, would get put into positions that would cause ruinous damage to the company. And we just kept having to learn
Mm.
this lesson. And most left anarchists left because the overall leadership and attitudes of the company have just become much, much more right wing over time. Like the more direct engagement in the reality and the much more like reading and research and engagement you're doing, it's just like extreme right wing energy was sort of nationally present when I showed up like 8 years ago. And it is like completely dominant hard R here now. So there's just been a change in the demeanor of most everyone involved in the operation, even over the early anarchist and cyberpunk, operative states, like the right wing kind of Trump-esque super energy, like NRX logic, like, Moldbug has visited and we've spent time conversing with him and that kind of thing. Like there was a structural change in the vibe around these places that has occurred. I would love to see more things happen with the enterprise, but I think it's going to be kind of this next generation as the Zoomers and younger millennials kind of decide, okay, this is where things are operative here now. Where can we go from there? And I think it's the operations that you're discussing, or the operations that have been discussed on Blood Satellite, or essentially anything right wing right now, is just been, well, how do we do this for real? Like we were kids on the internet for a while, and that was fun, but this is essentially a feminine approach to living. How can we actually do something? And so I think that we're very interested in engaging in those fronts as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I obviously I agree very heavily with this idea of like, how do we go from here? I think, you know, you already kind of hit the nail on the head when you were saying earlier that the best thing that we can do is just build businesses, right? And a big point, and I like to stress this, I'm sure if people have heard the podcast, they've heard me make this point before, which is, um, and basically when I first got online, the first problem that I saw with the right wing was we got too easily frustrated by things. It was too much living in opposition to evil and not enough pursuit of good. And so the question became, in my mind, how do I define that for other people, right? When they first get to the space, giving them like a best practice guide for waking up and then orienting themselves. And so I created the journey. Right? It's a 5-step process, and you awaken, you build your framework, you improve. And initially, I had content creation and then parallel movement. And the reason I had content creation is because I think by writing out your ideas and thinking about things, that helps you process them, and then you put them online, and you meet other people who have similar ideas, and you kind of have this cohesion. You build this network, and then you can build projects. Right? That's kind of the idea. But the thing is, I actually shifted that to networking, right? Because I feel like one of the problems that we have in the space is that there'll be people who come around with projects, and people will be really excited about those projects. There'll be good ideas, right? But the problem inherently with them is you have all these people who pour in, they'll start putting energy into the idea, and then because the cohesion isn't there, because the network did not exist previous to the idea, there's going to be frustrations. There's going to be people kind of, the learning curve of getting to know people, and understanding if they're trustworthy, or just even how to work with them, because we all have our own kind of quirks and weirdness, right? Like you kind of talk about these, left anarchists coming in and realizing like, oh, they don't have the wherewithal to actually be dependable, right? I think that's a very common phenomenon with a lot of these projects. And so I say that the focus needs to be, um, fraternal networks. Like you need to build the network, and the network in and of itself is a goal. And from that network, then you will arise projects, and those are worth pursuing. But kind of all of this to say, and it's funny that you mentioned the Peter principle, because I've been bringing that up a lot recently. I think that there's a lot of content creators out there who became very prominent content creators, but the next thing that we need to do is network. It's build relationships between men. It's start to build businesses, parallel projects. And if you are a content creator out there who is only good at creating content and word selling and thinking about these ideas, then you're not like you're quickly going the way of the dinosaur, right? like you're still going to be important, right? Like, and we still need our theory cell guys to kind of light up that beacon. But my concern is you have a lot of these people who are kind of holding people in orbit, right? They're not letting them move on to the next thing, which is, it's like once you get the message, hang up the phone, right? Like once you've read enough Jordan Peterson, right? Like there's no reason for you to keep reading Jordan Peterson. It's like, oh yeah, be responsible, cool, like got it. My room is clean. Let me go on to other things, right? And I think that that's kind of the, focus that I want to see going forward. I think you guys are way ahead of the curve, right? Understanding that building business and kind of waging this kind of creative pushback against the limitations of the government. It also kind of, to your point, kind of set up a beacon where you were able to attract people. It's interesting to me, right, that you have been so under the radar, right? Like I didn't know about your stuff until we met up, and but I've had conversations with other people in the space, like Clay Martin, who I don't know if you guys have gotten a chance to connect yet, but he is very excited to spend a little time talking to you. But he remember hearing his thoughts, and he was just like, "Wow, yeah, they're doing great stuff. Like those guys are like absolute badasses, right?" And so I think this is a big part of the reason that I wanted to have you on the cast is I don't think enough people are aware of what you're doing. I think there's a huge amount of value in it. It's very like there's a beauty to it of being kind of creative and uh like waging this war and kind of finding these ways to create this stuff, and knowing that it's not like a money thing. This is very much a philosophical kind of ideological thing, and it's really cool to see. But I'm taking a really long time to get to kind of the point that I'm trying to make, which is I absolutely agree that what we need to be doing is creating pretty standard businesses, right? Finding ways to make money, and then supporting endeavors like this, right? There's this kind of joke in the content creator sphere that most of us content creators do have a job, right? Because the ones who don't, right, the ones who have to make money from their content, the problem that they're going to have is they're going to have to put out content that people are consuming. They have to make money from their patrons. And don't get me wrong, like I think that there is a way to do that where you're not getting warped by, you're not getting like audience captured, or not getting like some wealthy person coming around and telling you what you need to do. But um, I do see that being the case sometimes, right? This is what journalists are inherently. Um, but a lot of the good content creators that I've run into, they're like also have families and jobs, right? Like they're competent in a range of other ways, and they're just simply deciding that this is something that is valuable to do and necessary for society, and so they're willing to make that sacrifice. And so I think that's very much what you guys are doing. And my hope is that with this podcast, and hopefully we can get you guys on like with Dimes and some of the other great content creators in the space, right? Raise a little bit of awareness, because it was funny. I was talking to one of the guys who I don't know if I should kind of like say who he is, but he's a content. He's not a content. He runs a business in our space. Very cool guy, and they sell a product, and he made this really interesting point, which is that for a lot of people, his product is kind of like uh, they're not actually using it. It's more of like you kind of made the analogy to Funko Pops, right? There's no function, like these people don't see it as functionality. It's more of a signal kind of thing. Um, and to some degree, I kind of jokingly said, well, I was going to buy one of your things, and yes, it was definitely going to be a signal. I wasn't necessarily going to read it, although I think that would be fun. And I think it's kind of the same with this, where we a lot of our guys would probably have the ability to buy things maybe of like in a more easier way, or the higher quality, or whatever it is, right? Like this is clearly something that if you are, as you said, you're like someone who appreciates this and wants to do it like creatively and all that kind of stuff. But I think that is like a really healthy thing, right? Like I think, like for example, like our guys writing books, you don't have to buy a book because you want to read it, or that you like need the information inside of it. It's more of like supporting these businesses that are doing these things. And so, I do think that that is kind of where we need to go, is we need to get people more aware of those who are running these businesses, who are actually doing these creative and progressive, progressive in the sense of like driving things forward in an actually healthy way, things, right? And then we also, need to just make it so that our guys are so wealthy, right, that we can all support each other inherently, just the businesses that we're running. Um,
Well,
so
I
that
think
being
the
said,
big thing that's like surmised in everything you're discussing, because I'm taking notes to like, articulate the thoughts, because there's a lot happening. It's the whole universe of life occurring. I think the big context is to get outside of the liberal coercion. And by that, it's does the fish, when you talk to a fish and you ask it, how's the water? The fish doesn't have any idea what you're talking about because it exists within the water. And the same goes for essentially all basic contextual, economic, and technical baselines that everyone has to encounter. Like the idea of a Facebook 80 years ago is just beyond the pale. They could understand it. You give them 5 or 6 minutes and they'd be able to see that, oh, I can see my ex girlfriend's titties pretty quickly whenever I want to, is kind of an interesting thing to them. But like the framework that like it's just the normalization of the sorts of experiences we're having. We forget a lot of other basic considerations. And I'd say the big thing that everyone has to get over is liberal individualism of like, yes, you are an individual entity acting in a universe under the context of space and time with your own Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like we're all individualized, right? We're not, AI or anything. Like we have to exist at what some level of resolution, but a unique element of the now as opposed to any other period of time is that our being is not directly related to all of the beings in our immediate vicinity. Whereas prior, it's hard to disentangle the cognition and nervous systems and like autoimmune systems or religious perceptions, like your ability to see the world. Like none of these things were really disentangleable from you and your peers. Like you were acting as a gestalt organism for most of human. This is what community actually constitutes. And that's what most human experience is. That's what being a social animal is. Like when you isolate a social animal, it goes crazy and self-destructs. Like that's how they operate. And so I think the same thing needs to be applying to the strategic and material layers. So to be very specific, here's a good example. I love the Zoomers, right? I'm a millennial, but like 93. So like right at the cusp, right at the end point of what a millennial is. I love the Zoomers. Very intelligent, very completely unimpressed with the modern propaganda. They don't really exist within the normalcy of the system. They engage in fun, artistic, and kind of depressive modes. But I'm from like Alaska, so I know what depressive mode is all about. Like I vibe entirely with the thing. On the other hand, though, because of their access to a constant stream of information and requiring an autonomic response to that information, essentially everyone has to have an opinion on everything. That's what a mass media experience is. Like you're bombarded with positions and takes and operations, like somehow your voice matters. Like it doesn't really directly, connect to a dollar sense thing. It's just sort of like as an individual acting in the polity, you must understand the whole universe. You must be the theory cell par excellence. Like that's what human existence has become. And the Zoomers, in response to this, have taken on a level of arrogance that is incredibly surprising to me. And I like will work directly or engage with them on things, and they just think they know the answer. It's not as like, disgustingly irritating as the boomers' arrogance, but it's its own kind of like arrogant statement on their ability to learn new information and like manipulate their local reality. And they're very antagonistic to manipulating the local reality, i.e., engaging in experiments and changes that they cannot immediately foresee, and engaging in procedures that can, adjust their own perception and improve or engage on the affairs of other people. And I think not enough people are really engaging with what the youth experience is, the sorts of like terrible inputs that they're presented with. But also keep in mind, they don't have any of the primary useful information. This is why like the distribution of stuff from game or like pickup back in the day has become very, very powerful. Is it was just a concerted autistic effort to communicate the nature of masculinity and femininity. Now, it was mostly meant for men to be able to pick up whores more easily. So it's got a very limited valence, but it ended up becoming this huge focus of like, oh, almost all of human history includes cultural artifacts for telling us how men are and how women are and how they kind of interact in reality and how they should interact ideally. And then this is how you play through that. If everyone is presented with just their own experiences, having to play like Sherlock Holmes at like every single opportunity, you don't get good information out of it. And it's horrible. Like it's just a total waste of the millennia of culture we've had available. Like you're just sort of lost without a paddle. And this applies directly to business elements, like teaching people the basics of networking, teaching them the business basics of a business, because a business is constituted of three essential elements. Business is constituted of your operational expenditure, your day-to-day costs, your capital expenditure, which is the initial costs that develop that business, and then your customers. So the relationship you have with those customers, what the customer demand is, how it's fulfilled, how you negotiate with them, how prices are set, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like these basic conceptual frames, which an older generation would communicate to you as naturally as breathing, is completely lost. We have to just reinvent civilization. Like we're living in an era of digital barbarism. And this is kind of the bigger question that networks have to attack. And this is like what people need to really be thinking about is competence and cohesion and ideological clarity or emotional valence. These are all interesting and necessary, but just keep in mind that everyone is retarded and they have no incentive to communicate the degree of their ignorance on these subjects. Like no one's
Mm.
willing to just accept the humility of, yeah, maybe what do you call it? It's that classic adage, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Like maybe I don't
Mhm.
know how these structures are actually applying, and maybe I don't care that I don't know. Maybe I just want to know a guy that can help me in some nepotistic fashion to make a bunch of money selling these casters for trolleys or something. Like I don't need to be involved in this sexy business. I would just like to make my bag and then help all the other entities in my path once I'm making that bag. But if you are at a level of dependence on your local job or your local economy to a degree that you can't think of another option or you can't engage with other people to go to another option, not only is that the liberal coercive slavery that's at play for most people, right? Everyone was farmers until 70 years ago. But like not only is that the political control that's being applied to you, but also you yourself are under such levels of stress and like inability to operate that you can't think rationally in any context. There's no feedback loops being applied to you the same way that a content creator who has a job and who has a family has those feedback loops applied. If you're just sort of sitting in this ether of dependence, you don't really have an understanding of the world. And as a result, you shouldn't have opinions about the world. You should shut your
Mm.
slave mouth because that's what you are.
No, I absolutely agree. It's interesting that you're kind of making this point because before I got my start on the Meta Prime project, I actually did a lot of content creation around my job as a tech recruiter. So I was a head of talent for a bunch of different startups. Have helped build at least two unicorns that I know of. I have to check in on some of my old stock that I have a hold of, but. Um, recruiting not that glamorous of a role. I think we talked a little bit about this. Most recruiters are idiots. They're colored by number. They just kind of like fill things out. But if done well, recruiting is really important. And I think it's probably part of the reason that I'm like so keen on network building and that's what I love to do and had a lot of success in that in the space. But um, when I was in recruiting, kind of going back to what I was talking about the importance of um, like teaching, or maybe this is another conversation I had today. I've been talking to a lot of people, but teaching is a really important thing, right? It like helps you clarify your own ideas and transfer that to other people is also inherently very satisfying when you can help other people get it. But so I started writing a lot about recruiting for philosophy, not just like from the recruiting side, but also from the candidate side, right? Because you have a lot of people who go out, they look for jobs, right? They do the interviews, and very rarely do they do not a lot of people interviewing all the time, right? Like usually you go through interviewing for a stint and then you get a job, and then usually you get like referrals from there if you're decent, right? You kind of end up in jobs, or maybe so interviewing is something people do typically very sporadically, and so they're not necessarily very good at it. They haven't developed like a common set of best practices or whatever it is. And a lot of the stuff, again, if you have a bunch of idiot recruiters online, they're not writing good content around how to interview effectively. It's a lot of those, like LinkedIn, here's the top 10 things that you should ask during an interview, or whatever it is. um, so a lot of my content was on kind of sharing with people best practices around that. And it's interesting because I think it was very much also meant to instill a certain amount of self ownership, right? There was a bunch of layers to this, but one of the layers is this idea of like, people would come to me, have on my LinkedIn like, oh, you can ask me for resume help. People come and I'd say, okay, here's the article that I wrote about how to write a good resume. Go read it. Come back if you have any questions. Happy to take a little bit of time to talk. And I would say about 1 in every 10 people who reached out to me would come back and say, hey, I read the article. Let's like talk a little bit more about my resume, right? And it's just because the intention is not there, right? Like there's a lot of people who think that they want to break from, kind of the mundane, or, go beyond what they're doing. But really, they just want to kind of do this performative thing of like, they want somebody else to do it for them, right? And to your point, like I think that we all have to understand that we're not. I think it was like Clay Martin who's saying that, like, you don't have to be a red queen. You don't have to do everything. Right? You don't have to have every base covered. You can, and that's the value of the network, right? And so I think that's kind of the point that I'm coming around to here is that a lot of our guys would benefit greatly from having a network, especially the younger ones. This is a big thing that I try to stress with, like, I run into Zoomers and have this kind of conversation. It's like, you're pretty fucked. And you're pretty fucked because, it used to be the case you could just go through the kind of existing hurdles of the system, and that did a pretty good job of filtering you out if you were, high quality, and, sorting you into a good job and allowing you to make money. Now it's very much not the case, right? Like you can actually be pretty damn smart and still be rejected by the system in a big way. And so, how do you, find a good place in the system? Well, it's, guys like us creating these networks, building these relationships such that, we have opportunities to bring people in, right? We have opportunities to connect people and synergize and move them where they need to go. And so I think, your kind of your point is really well taken, that, a lot of people are very much unaware of the opportunities to break from the system, to do things in interesting ways. I think that's what I find so interesting about Defense Distributed, right? Is you guys are doing some really creative and interesting stuff, right? Like there's a lot of these guys on the vanguard, right? That I run into at our space. Like they're there, and they like, maybe they don't even know it. Like maybe like I kind of get the impression that you have a certain sense of self-awareness and appreciation for where you guys are and what you're doing, just the way you've been talking about it. But like that is a very unique thing, and I think a lot of our guys make the mistake early on, like, oh, I can just work a 9 to 5 harder, right? And that's the way I'm going to get ahead, right? But we really need to find alternative ways. And I think, the networking, kind of the sharing of information, because I think it's a really difficult hamstring, or disadvantage to put all of our guys behind, to not share with them these kind of like best practices or insights, right? That they can then, if they're smart enough to listen to, pick up and apply. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that what do you call it? I just have too much reading, and so I keep forgetting that abstractions are irrelevant to people that aren't doing the reading and also don't make a lot of sense. So
Hmm.
I think a good illustration would be how I got involved. For years with the early DD stuff, they had a media presence. There still is a media presence. There's a YouTube channel with Defense Distributed. Put up product videos, put up lectures. There's some decent stuff on there. YouTube, hates us, so we don't get a lot of traction anymore. Like formally pushed, there's like certain lawsuits under Texas law that can be applied to engage with that, but like we're definitely hyper canceled before anyone else. Uh, but early days, like let's say like the Neo reaction when that was happening, 2011 to 2014, that kind of era when I was engaging on the Twitter politics, there was this video that they did when they were selling the Ghost Gunner, and all it was illustrating was just young, dangerous white guys in blacked out garages working on weird technical projects that were antagonistic to this backroom style liminal energy that America was presenting at the time. And like, we're just embracing that and working on something that's fundamentally antagonistic to it. And that video really stuck with me, and the philosophies that were being spent really, really stuck with me. Like there's a classic video of Cody back in the day talking with Glenn Beck, and he's essentially lecturing this guy about Foucault from like an ultra right wing perspective. Like Glenn Beck, the weird Mormon, right, getting just completely philosophy hammered in like a relatively public manner. And it was just this sort of strange approach of, oh, you can have ideas and you can have techniques and you can have operations that manipulate the universe, that like per BAP, right, a conquest of space, like a gathering, like an opening to make decisions and to change the game. And that was just very, very important to me. And I ended up having a familial connection through cryptocurrency that got me involved, and I was able to visit the shop and during a Christmas party, and Cody and I discussed like Alex Forrest's train Twitter back in the day for like 30 minutes, and then I asked for a job. So there's sort of this vibe energy applying at the time. But something that happened then that I haven't seen at all in any other place, I'm always looking for, is just this description of a vibe and an approach to the vibe, the same way that occurred, I think, with both Japanese and American biker gangs. And this is just a very clear, quick description of what like a historic manor bund looks like. Of just, there's a set of people doing a set of things. There's a youth and danger associated with it. There's a set of practices and principles and objectives articulated in that pathway. And I think that's kind of the big thing. When people individually are faced with a set of difficult problems, the resolution of those problems have to be done partially intuitively from a gut reaction. But what that ends up being is you get a bunch of people that are really upset about something, and then you come up with a strategy, and then suddenly that strategy becomes the only possible strategy. Whereas I think about this a little bit more aphoristically, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And the only way to realize that there's more than one way to skin a cat is if your objective is to skin the cat. And I think most people are uncomfortable trying to determine specifically what are they trying to accomplish before they determine the set of strategies that will like realize that. And so you kind of see that with people like you're describing with, I'm going to do this thing, but I really hope that somebody else fulfills this thing for me. There's a performative nature to their communications and their activities. But this makes sense for like 80% of the human population. This performative and ritualistic activity may lead to an outcome that they require, even if they don't truly believe it, but they're not measuring the actual. But a deep, unique element of the Western philosophy and science and mathematics, as opposed to non-Western philosophy, sciences, and mathematics, has been this necessity for focusing on the actual. Like, do these inputs lead to reliable outputs? Like, is my behavior actually doing something, or am I just fulfilling some emotional need on my end? So I think if you have a set objective and a way of measuring that filtration towards that objective, I think that's super necessary. But you also have to keep in mind you're not acting on your own. You're acting in context of other people. And ideally, you're acting in context with other people across generational and skill divides. like, okay, so not everyone should be a content creator, but there should be some people who are doing content creation so you can distribute the standard operating procedures and the memes and the aspects of life. But then there's also this reminder of like, well, you have to live life. So for me, I take great pains to include creatives in my social circles. Like almost all of my friends I hang out with, we're all going to church. Many of them are professional musicians, or like if they're amateur musicians, they're extremely well qualified and can play at the level of the professionals. They engage deeply in poetics. There's lots of dancing. There's this engagement of the human experience as it's meant to be engaged with, but it's not meant to be collated as a media experience. It's meant to be directly experienced. It's meant to be immediately consumed. It's the potlatch. It's the wasteful energy. Like there's something to existence that has to be described. But on the other hand, I meet people all the time in this place. This is a very weird town. Lots of things kind of come here. And yes, many of the ideological and theoretic readings I've had allow me to have productive conversations with people. So there's this, balance of like uh, intellectual specific digressions to the degree can signal you're interesting or you're doing something fun, but also that your life is not meant to be engaging in intellectual digressions. These are things that you meditate upon and contemplate and work through like a
Mm,
mathematics problem. They're not
yeah.
a consumptive element, except if you're a mathematician. But like, there's very few real mathematicians. Most of us are meant to live real lives. We should have inputs that are providing for us and our family. There should be women that we're finding that we're filling with children. The children that we have should be shared in an environment that builds them up. Like, okay, boxing is interesting to me. Like, I have engaged in jujitsu for years, but boxing is interesting to me. But boxing is supremely interesting to me as an activity I should be prepared to communicate to my own progeny or my nieces and nephews. Like, there's this shift in like what your activity should be in order to build up the people in your immediate locality, because you're not just you. And if you try to change things as just you, it's nonsensical. You will have very limited adjustment of the reality, but you can help
Mm.
provide for other people that can.
Yeah, I love this. It's interesting. So when I was going through writing the journey, right, the 5 steps of the journey, the second step after awakening is framework building, right? Basically, the idea is you realize everything is a delusion and not real and an inversion, and the question becomes, okay, well, what do you believe? How do you like ground yourself, and then so that you can then orient yourself towards something. And it was interesting because when I sat down to write framework building, I was thinking to myself, okay, like I'll probably write um, some general ideas, which I did end up writing. Like, it's just like if you want to understand why people act a certain way, look at the incentives of the system, and you'll understand the actions and stuff like that. But what really kind of came out of writing the framework building article was making the point that, well, the idea of building a framework, right, it's an abstraction of reality, of truth, right, that's going to work for you in navigating the world. But you don't need to find truth and create a framework. What you need to do is realize, what are you actually navigating towards, and then build the framework that's necessary to navigate towards that thing, right? So the actual first step after you've awakened to, how wrong everything is to realize what is actually valuable, right? And what is actually valuable is family. It's natalism. It's having kids. It's having meaningful relationships with people. It's being able to provide for yourself and to become competent and to pursue these kind of higher things, right? Like that, this is a lot of the reason that people find religion typically when they're also waking up to the political side of things. You have a lot of people who come back because what they're trying to figure out is, what is valuable, what should I orient myself towards, right? And then once you have that goal of what to orient yourself towards, then you can start building a framework. Because the mistake that a lot of people make when they wake up is they're like, oh, the government's a lie, I got to figure out if like lizard people are running the government, or if there's actually like aliens in area 51, or all these kinds of things. And it's very tangential, right? It's not important. It's entertainment. It's conspiratainment bait, right? To kind of your point, right? It's like it is good to have conversations about things because those things are vehicles to explore the philosophy of ideas. But you also like the most important thing that you can orient yourself towards is the betterment of your own life, right? This was kind of a fundamental idea when I was recruiting, and I would ask people like, why do you want this job? Right? Like, what specifically led you to believe that this is the job that's best for you? And the best answer to that question is something along the lines of like, well, I am trying to achieve X, Y, and Z thing in my life, and this is, step 3 of, 7 on my path to wherever I want to get to. And, this company is a good fit because of X, Y, and Z reason, right? And it shows us a sense of awareness, right? You have a goal, you have a path to, a plan to get there. You're trying to make decisions that kind of correlate and fit with that. But one of the things that I experienced as a recruiter very often was that people would basically say, "Well, this is a job. Like I am a product manager, and this is a product manager position, and you are a company, and I do work, and you give me money, and that's how this works, right?" And to me, that was a very strong indication that this person was probably not going to work, or at the very least, they were not like an S tier player, right? Or probably not even an A tier player, because A tier guys are pretty solid and they can answer that question well. This is probably a B or a C level player, right? So uh,
Well,
all
on
that to
this front
say,
though, like you're
yeah,
describing this generalized NPC response to existence, and I actually think there's something valuable in that because what we've been talking about, or at least I've been especially hinting about, is this ultra pragmatism, which usually is a naive political response. And ultra pragmatism is both demoralizing and boring unless you engage on it in like a systems theoretic sense. It's just
sure,
like a
sure,
lived experience. But what I like about it, like what ultra pragmatism does when you're really trying to review what your relationships with yourself and with your people and with your God, with this forces in your perception allows you to negotiate with the primary sources of the past. Like you can read history books, and there's a great value in reading history books and reading the narratives and stories that surround you to give you context. But there's a big difference between reading like David Hackett Fisher or any other character that's describing history abstractly, and reading someone like Herodotus and like his primary source, where Herodotus like just basically did a road trip around the not just Greece, not just ancient Greece, but like Persia and all this. Like he was going around and gathering stories, engaging. You can find in the primary characters of the past, oh, they have much of the same demands and problems I have. And now, like I said much earlier, that there's a unique element to modernity and technical society, which is horrifying and totally controlling, but there's still this biologic, deep rooted solar experience that everyone has to negotiate with. And you can go into the roots of history and explore. And once you're engaging with primary sources, these guys begin to unravel the mystic and philosophic experiences where theoretical domains begin to open up. And you lose it if you spend your time reading introductions or reading people making commentaries. Like if you engage with primary sources, even the ultra geniuses like Baudrillard in their own writing, if you take your life seriously, you can engage with the top tier talent of all of human history, and you can share it with your like locality of people, and you can share it with your own experience. Like there's some level of engagement with those characters which make all the schizo posting worth it once you realize that these great men of history are fellow travelers, and they may be smarter and more accomplished than you, but all they want to do, even if it's egotistical on their part to have written it down, all they want to do is tell you how to live. Like you must change your life. Like they just have this desire to help the people. That's why they're writing it down. Outside of like Marcus Aurelius's diary, which is just what the meditations are. Like that's a very rare exception. Like most documents are produced as a communication vessel. They want to improve your life. You can just go to them. Like your dad may not be there, your granddad may not have been
hmm
there, your males in your local locality may not recognize necessity to imbibe mimesis or proper behavior on their fellows. But the great geniuses of history were so autistic that they needed to do it for all human time. So you can at least engage with them, and that is the value of theory, outside of the boring necessitude of pragmatics.
Yeah, no, there's a, I think it's Rectimedes, a good mutual of mine, and he makes the point that the internet is a very interesting place where you can use it to just watch endless cat videos or argue with, and get involved in dumb arguments with complete idiots, or you can like literally seek out the greatest thinkers of all time, and read their works and find other people who are also passionate about that and have like very interesting discussions, right? Like it's amazing information that's just there for the taking. It is really, really cool. And I think that's what I love about this space so much. And I think that's to some degree what's hard for people to realize when they get into this space, how kind of rare this is. Like we are in one of the most connected times in history. I mean, are you the most connected time in history, right? And arguably, the filtering mechanisms are very strong right now, right? It's like if you come online and you're creating content or talking about ideas, right? You could very quickly recognize like who has the capacity for, really interesting thought to drive things forward, like, and also to kind of find your space, your way to our little space on the internet, right? Where we have all of these people having these interesting conversations, right? Like you had to reject the mainstream delusion. You had to find the internet. You had to find your way into the corner. You had to start interacting with those people. Typically, you make your way into like group chats, and like and like those people. Certainly there are brilliant people who don't go online or who don't write books, and they're just kind of brilliant in their own little corner of their experience, and it doesn't really shine out. Like I've met guys who worked at companies and done amazing things for those companies, but they're very like unsung heroes. They're not writing a story or going on a podcast or any of that kind of stuff, but what they did was pretty cool stuff. But the point being is we exist in a very rarefied group of people, and that's very cool, right? Like it's very neat to be able to interact with those kinds of people. It's like even better than reading these books. You can read, you could talk to people who have read all these books and then played around with all these thoughts and then kind of like you know help build what actually comes next. I think that to me is the most exciting part of all this, is we are creating at the cutting edge. And this is why I think this is kind of an important aside to make, is I do get pretty controversial with some of the groups that exist on the pipeline, like the BAP sphere and a lot of these kind of like secret guys who are going to, like now that Trump has won, right? They're going to encourage you to like, go die in a foreign war for Eric Prince, or they're going to tell you that like Israel's actually based and all this kind of stuff. And to me, like these are the worst people, right? These are the subversives who are effectively trying to blunt the cutting edge of the vanguard and what we're trying to create, because they are detracting people from natalism, right? From having families, from having communities, from having fraternities, from building businesses, from prosperity of basically who they are and their extended genetic lineage. And so to me, like it's worth fighting this battle, but and being creative, right? Because if you aren't creating something, right, if you're just providing social commentary, then who are you to kind of talk, right? Like you have to enter the arena, and entering the arena to some degree for a long time has been theory selling on the internet, but I think more and more people are realizing that entering the arena now means meeting in person, building relationships, building businesses, and
Well,
I
it's
do think
like
this is
meeting in the arena of your own life, right? So like you're mentioning the BAP thing and the recommendation of poor strategies. Now, yes, I think that dying in a mercenary war is actually mildly based. Like I do kind of enjoy this old what is that magazine series? I downloaded all of them. There's a classic like 1970s, 1990s. Um, it's like a mercenary mag, classic stuff. But like being able to go down to Zanzibar and like shoot up a village, like I kind of see the strong masculine impulse for
Mm,
this. Like I don't dispute it, and like I've had criminal elements in my own background before I was involved with DD. So like I get a lot of what Bronze Age mindset is about, but something that's
mm,
very clear to me as I got involved in communities and engaging with people, especially being like the only radical in a relatively charged but still spiritually potent group. People are living their lives, and when they talk about problems in their lives with other people, unless they're women, they tend to want solutions. They tend to rely on trusted parties. And
mm,
yes, for someone that's intelligent and cynical enough, you have to be very careful about advice. But most human beings aren't. So there's sort of this responsibility you have if you have an opinion on somebody's life that you should take responsibility for it in the same way of like Hammurabi's code of if an
mm.
engineer builds a bridge and somebody's son dies on the bridge, that engineer's son was put up to death. Like you have to have that same level of intensity about any advice you proffer. And you can do that IRL in the club building, in the Manor Bun building, in this like formalized political project. But you can also do it just with your local connections. Like you have an influence on the human beings around you and take what you're
Mm.
saying seriously. If you take a radical approach, that is awesome. Just take it to its logical conclusion. Like go all the way with a radical attitude.
Yeah. I mean, this is very important, right? Is you know, in my mind, a good leader does not create dependency. A good leader empowers people to take ownership, right? And the problem that I see in the sphere when it comes to a lot of these content creators is we were talking earlier about the Peter principle, right? It's like these content creators basically get to a point where they've maxed out. They don't have the ability to network or to generate value for their audience. And so what they basically become is, well, they start you know having a parasitic relationship with their audience, right? They start extracting value from their audience, right? Because initially the idea is if you're a good content creator, you're providing something to your audience that is valuable, right? That makes their lives better, hopefully, like actually better, not just from an entertainment standpoint. um, but then you've cultivated this large audience. It's like, why wouldn't you, like you got to do something with that, right? Like you can't just keep telling the same people the same thing over and over and over again, right? um and so that's my I think concern with a lot of these guys is like, well, what is your motivation, right? Like what are you actually trying to do? And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about like if you have another job or if you have a broader goal, right? Like for me, my goal is to network people together, is to share this information and make the space better, right? And let people know of the different parallel projects that are going on, and hopefully like they can find one to support or get involved in, right? But I don't want like a bunch of followers that I can kind of like farm for Patreon dollars or whatever it is. Like I want to build a network of peers that I can collaborate with and build something meaningful with, and then have an impact on the future, and in a positive way, such that the kids that I'm hoping to have will live in a world where the people around them, right, my fraternal brothers are creating a healthy community that is going to take care of them, right? And there's also this other thing. Bennett from the exit group, he said this to me one time, and this is like one of my favorite things to talk about right now, especially considering I'm on such a strong natalism kick. But he makes the point that it's not just kids, but also grandkids that we need to be focused on. And the reason for grandkids, obviously, is longer time scale, and so you're going to be optimizing better, right? That's always good, iterative. But also the point that like you only have kids with your wife, but um, you can have shared lineage through your grandkids with your friends, right? Your friends can have kids, you can have kids, and then your kids meet, and they grow up, and then they get together, and they have you have grand they have kids, and so your grandkids are shared with the some of the brothers in your fraternal network, right? Like that is that really bonds you together. It makes you realize that the fraternal network, at the most at the first generation level is not going to be familial, but at the grandkid level, like that it becomes familial, right? And so there's a lot of
Well, I
value
think
in this.
you can go a lot harder on that front, where when you review the statistical outcomes for children's lives, the two major factors is first, who is your partner? And that's kind of their heredity. So, like, your partner's ancestry is a large part of it. And this is what most heredity and like the essential eugenic principle of marriage is. But the other thing is peers. And so it's like homeschooling is very, very big, but also like who are your children around? And if you are doing appropriate mate selection and you've surrounded yourself with people who are also doing appropriate mate selection, then there's a fairly good chance that everyone's kids are going to be good enough that those peer selections are valuable to inculcate. So even before your grandkids are coming around, like you can improve the state of your kids' lives because your kids' lives are just a reflection of your own life. And if you surround yourself with good people that are producing those children, you can have a good life with those people.
Yeah, this is actually the article that I'm writing right now. It's almost done. I'm gonna have this one out soon, so it's kind of a little bit of a spoiler for those who are listening now. But basically, I've come around, especially after kind of arguing with a lot of the people in our sphere about where do I go next, what's actually valuable, and why I'm going to total BAP death the sphere now that the election's over. But it's basically that there's a trinity, right? It is fraternity, it is community, and then it is family, right? Or natalism, right? Like having kids and setting them up for success. And to your point, um, and I spend whenever I read an article, one of the things that I do is I take a lot of time to really hone the ideas in the article. It's very important to me that it's not just a matter of getting something out and getting the ideas out, because a lot of times when I write, like I develop, as I kind of referenced earlier, the framework article, I realized that you need to have that goal informs what kind of framework you build, because it's what kind of information is relevant to this, in this case, right? It's in order for you to have a family, as you're pointing, like the community is an essential part. There's kind of two pieces of this, right? You have your wife, and you have your kids. And this is one of the problems that BAP articulates, is like, oh, we live in this like longhouse society where women are just these incessant evil harpies that they're very difficult to tame, right? And his solution is just go out and be a mercenary and all that kind of stuff. And I understand that. It's appealing, and but also at the same time I think it undermines that ultimate goal of natalism. Right. And so the real response to this, if you're actually a man, is to say, look, like it's a difficult problem, but just because it's difficult doesn't mean I shouldn't solve it. And the way that you solve the woman problem is not to be the ultimate Chad. I mean, that certainly helps. Don't get me wrong. Like you want to be a good man, but the other key part of this is you surround yourself with other good men, right? With other good families, right? This is why we kind of make that joke of like it's like the woman who has the girl who has the bad father, right? Like that's the one you want to kind of go after if you're just looking for like loose fun women, right? It's because it's like she doesn't have any standards because her father wasn't around and like inculcated with the right standards, right? The family wasn't there to provide the power structure, and so
Shit.
sorry about that. I think the internet sometimes cuts in and out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I thought it was a internet issue on my end.
Yeah, no, it was my fault. But uh, I'll kind of wrap up the point that I'm making here is basically I absolutely agree with you. Community is really important. I made a post where I talked about the card from Magic the Gathering called Control Magic. Are you familiar with this card?
No, no, I was never a Magic guy.
Oh man, I feel like I could get you into it. You would probably like playing the game. But control magic, basically what it does is it you cast it, and you enchant your opponent's creature, and then it becomes your creature. You're just controlling it, right? And in any type of game, you're thinking about like resources, right? And so in Magic, you have like a 1-for-1 where it's like you cast a card and you get a card's worth of value, right? So you like play a creature, and it's like that one card is like it's a 3/3 creature on the board, right? It's like a 1-for-1. Or you have like a kill spell, right? It's like kill target creature, and you kill your opponent's creature. It's like you spent a card to kill one of his cards, so it's a 1-for-1. But control magic is actually 2-for-1. The reason it's a 2-for-1 is because when you cast it, yeah, you're just getting a creature on your side of the board, but you're also depriving your opponent of a creature, right? You're killing, and typically their best creature, and you're gaining this very powerful creature. That is a huge swing, and that's exactly
So
how I
it's
see
a
community.
zero-sum game.
Well, it's kind of like like if you can take something that is, instead of it being negative, it's like a positive, right? That's not just like, it's like the person you kind of mentioned, the left anarchists, right? Like imagine instead of having a left anarchist, you have an actually like based guy, right? Well, all the problems that you have with left anarchist, not only are those problems not there, but now you have someone who's actually productive and adding value, right? Like instead of something that you have to like, weather and like figure and fill the gaps, right? Like you have something that's adding value to your life. That's how I see community. So I think like it's really important that people really like it's that's stressed, that people really understand how important community is to raising families.
Well, I have a good, I think, connection to wrap everything up that makes sense here, especially the
Yeah.
Fuentes drama and him like, taking credit for the Trump victory. Um,
Hmm.
I've been discussing like generational differentiation. And like, yeah, you should include the Xers and millennials and boomers to the degree that they're helpful. And I have many characters that are helpful for me on that front. But there's this shifting your thinking from individualized, normal public school grade, 1 through 12, right? Like this sort of K through 12, I guess, technically, of like you only know people within a year or two of you, and shifting to a generational focus is in this element of productivity and radical and exciting and attractive and developmental. There's different domains that different people need to operate in. Much as a woman is the only one that can bear children, a father is the only one that can bear certain relationships. Yet, on the other hand, what is most attractive is the breaking of boundaries and the exploration. But the explorers are taking great risks, and it's immoral for somebody taking great risks to take on a family due to the dynamics against the family. So the way I frame it is in essentially just emulating what's existed for all prior fraternal structures, which is an inner circle, outer circle conceptual framework, where your inner circle are your family men, are your wealthy men, are your guys that have actually something to lose if they're doxxed, but that have actual very strong sway, that have extreme network effects, that have the resources at play, who can marry daughters off, who can assign sons to companies, right? Like the guys with actual power have a lot to lose if that power is clearly illustrated to the public. And that's just clear for everybody, even like non-occulted, just like let's like take black communities, right? If like the real movers and shakers are demonstrated very clearly, then a significant amount of game theoretic systems begin to apply even to the low IQ guys because they're just trying to take advantage wherever that energy is sifting. On the other hand, if those inner circle men have an outer circle of young men who are able to prove themselves in challenges, those young men can go out and do the more dangerous exploratory things and can actually engage and discover the things they need to and
Hmm.
make the connections they need to in domains that the inner circle would be foolish to explore. I think people need to be
Hmm.
thinking a little bit more generationally and also understanding human biodiversity, where some people are very, very good at settling down and building a garden. And some people are extremely capable of acting in hardy conditions. Like I myself, I do not get stressed in extreme conditions. Like they just do not
Hmm.
affect me. But as a result, my adaptability makes it very difficult for me to take advantage of compound interest and like build things up in a stable, quiet environment.
Yeah.
And so it's like you have to be able to take people that are more useful on your frontiers and place them there and have them fight those battles, even if it's just online bitching and, fighting the culture war. There's some value for some characters in those domains. But like, even though we all kind of recognize the necessity of the compound interest of having a specific space and ownership and capacity and building up of it, because it's a real asset that gives you leverage, not only is it boring, which is difficult for some people,
Mm.
but like not everyone is called to that specific domain. So giving them places to like actually explore and develop. And I think that's kind of the big thing. You want to have these white label businesses that no one would think anything of, selling
Mhm.
basic commodities or whatever, just making money and building stuff up. And then the kids can engage in weird extracurricular activities. And that's how it really should be, because conservatism has that problem of stagnation without the necessary requisite variety. Like you're just like, oh, this is the way things are. It's like, no, that's the way things were for maybe a year or two, or maybe a
Mhm.
decade, or maybe this location has this resource and that benefits you. But the situation has changed. Someone has taken advantage of the rules of the game, and we need to stop them from taking advantage of you. Like there's just different roles for different folks. So even though everybody needs networking, everyone needs basic social acumen, everyone should go out and like,
Yeah.
touch grass and all that. Like sometimes people need to be doing weird stuff, and there has to be some way of negotiating these different tiers between them. And I'm just thinking of it because the comment that Mellon made. I don't know what NC/TN means, but he's saying,
North
speaking of
Carolina and
human
Tennessee.
capital, oh, okay. Speaking of human capital, I noticed a lot of high quality men showed up in North Carolina and Tennessee and met each other. Is there a way to replicate this effect without a disaster? And I think that's, I wasn't thinking of in terms of replicating the effect, but as much as filtering the effect. And you need to have high levels of challenge. So something needs to be interesting or valuable. And, 90% of that isn't from you. That's just objective reality. There's just domains where value and interest coincide. But if you're talking about the filtration that you were discussing, I think that the
Mm.
filtration occurs in terms of putting people in challenging environments that aren't meaningful outside of bodily death. And so I mean that in terms of like camping or something
Yeah.
or hunting, like places where old school hormonal situations flare, but like long term management of your assets isn't necessarily at risk. Like somebody isn't in charge of things that they shouldn't be in charge of. It's more like you and him had to share a specific experience and you could see the metal of his character. I think putting people in those situations, and many of these situations can be fun. Like you can go to like F1 or a concert or other sort of weird
Mhm.
social activities, and if someone's acting like a faggot, you can figure that out pretty quickly. And so it
Mm.
doesn't need to be as like so intensive. Just make sure the primary activity is fun and kind of low impact, and you can like filter people out relatively quickly. And that should be what the entirety of inner circle, outer circle dynamics are. It's just these fun sort of things that, oh, this guy is an outsider. Well, let's see how the outsider plays. Does he fit all the, ethnic, like ideological considerations we're looking for? And then if so, is he like a faggot? Is he an asshole? Is he a fed? Is he presenting weird things? Like where his incentive structures are at? Because somebody's emotional valence and incentive matrix, these are just very clear, like demonstrable things. And honestly, most people are incredibly incompetent and aren't going to play in some level of spycraft to hide that sort of thing. Like once somebody's like, okay, present someone with a beautiful woman and see how they act, right? Like if he's not
Mm.
confident in who he is, he'll just be taken immediately. Like just present people with difficult choices that aren't really that bad. You're not engaging in weather underground activities. Just like what is life like, and then filter from there. I think Dimes described it the best. You'll do a lot of heavy filtration with just normal work. Like if people are just trying to share a work enterprise, this guy is into it or he isn't. Like this guy isn't a team player, or this guy is a roadblock, or this guy's causing this sort of issue even before they're hired. Like you can engage in a variety of I mean, the military and corporate America for the past 100 years have been formalizing the techniques for a long time. And so you can
Hmm.
just do low level, like IQ ethnic filters, which are highly illegal in the corporate space, to do like most of the Pareto distribution of filtration. And that little bit can just be like, well, we went on a camping trip and then he took care of his stuff. Like I had a Catholic camping trip I had set up. I was running an adventure club for a while, and some guy brought a
Hmm.
kukri out, which is cool and very based, and I appreciated it. But he hadn't really used the kukri much, and he was cleaning up a log, and he sent the kukri right into his leg. And the immediate thing that me and a guy did when we saw it was like, okay, we need to get medical attention to him as quickly as possible, but
Hmm.
also somebody needs to go prevent the women from seeing what's happening right now. And like within like 10 seconds, the other guy distracted the females, and then I got the first aid kit and cleaned up his leg, and we were like, onto it because everyone recognized that this guy didn't puncture anything that would be super dangerous to his life, but like we would ruin the entire trip with demoralization if the females could engage in the hysteria on the event. And just like being in that experience, and nobody, I don't even really judge the guy. I still like the kukri. I still like that he brought it out. But it's sort of like everyone involved was very quickly able to assess the situation and resolve it in the simplest manner. And they're like, oh, well, I just trust these guys and like them now.
I love that you're on this wavelength, right? Because this is, I wanted to be able to talk about defense distributed. I think we did it justice at the beginning. I think you did an amazing job of kind of explaining what you guys are doing, and how like kind of an ingenious a little thing it is. But I also like this is effectively like this conversation has been fantastic because this is the core of my ideas, right? Is like, how do we bring these people together? How do we filter for the right people? How do we then, drive this forward? And, it's funny because I always can appreciate when people bring ideas I haven't heard, right? Because I've been playing around a lot with these thoughts. You kind of talked a little bit earlier about how a lot of times these are kind of like equations, right? It's kind of like doing math. It's like you come up with an equation, you figure out like what you need to weigh, and then you come up with a solution. And there's like a pretty objective solution to a lot of these things, right? And so a lot of times the discussions that we're having about like, how do we make decisions around these things, it's like a matter of, okay, what are the variables that exist in this equation and how do we measure them, and then therefore like, and then once weighed, how do we come up with a solution? And one of the points that you made that I haven't heard anyone else make, and I think it's an extremely important point, is that, I absolutely agree with the whole like filtering and filtering equality. The way that we do that out here in the PNW is we have these things called work parties. We basically show up at people's houses or businesses, a big group of guys, and they'll just have a slate of projects, right? So there's like fixing a car, putting up a fence, whatever it is, either drywall, installing a mini split, whatever it is that needs to get done, the guys will get it done, right? And it's nice. We have a long weekend. We'll spend some time together. We'll have meals. We get drunk at night. This also solves like the distance problem, right? This is something that I was talking about at the Dave the Distributist was at the Oregon Weavers event this past weekend, and one of the points that he made was, distance is kind of an issue. Where it's like you need to have people who are close because you're not going to drive like 3 hours to spend 1 hour hanging out with someone and then drive the 3 hours back, right? Especially if you have a family, you got other things going on. But if you have a longer period of time, you can justify the longer trip distance. And so these work parties are a great way to get to know people because, to your point, you're not just having ideological conversations or signaling to each other on the internet. It's like, oh, did you retweet this meme? Did you follow this guy? Like, can you actually have a conversation? You have a few drinks in you, or are you going to spurg out about the painter, or are you going to be able to hold your act together, right? And so to me, like that ability to like navigate that social scene, and by having these kind of very um, low risk projects, right? It's just you're swinging a hammer, you're putting things, up, you're installing a fence post. These are not particularly hard things to do, but the fact that you're showing up, that you're putting in the effort, that you can, display some competency is very important. And then, how do you interact socially? And that becomes the outer layer, right? And then there's the inner layer, which is like, okay, well, you can swing the hammer, you can do the stuff, you can talk the talk, you seem intelligent. Like, we'll bring you in on a business capacity, and we'll, talk about different business ventures that we're working on, and how you might be able to help improve yourself, and then get invested, and be able to earn in the group. And I think that's a very effective way to do that. But the thing that you said that I think is really worth kind of emphasizing is this idea that the outer group, right, these younger guys, I kind of split it between the established guys and the up and coming, right? And the up and coming, this is kind of a problem for me, is like, what do the up and coming guys do? Because a lot of times what they're doing is they're benefiting from the established guys, like, network, their capital, their projects, right? And so you can help with their projects. That's one thing, right? Is kind of what you're getting at. But categorizing it as what is, effectively, it's like what's the young man's game, right? Well, they can be adventurous, they can take risks, they can do these kind of more crazy things, as opposed to the established guys, they can't, right? Like, I'm very
You
lucky I live
should
in an
see
area.
it as criminal behavior. Like the Proto-Indo-European tradition. I forget the name of what it's called, but there is a warband tradition um,
Hmm.
of the young guy. It's essentially the bride napping stuff. Like, young guys are going out in mercenary parties and navigating and controlling the universe around them. And there's a whole structure of like interpolitics that became modern Western liberal politics. Like, their attitudes and their equivalencies between each other set this baseline of rights, of just dangerous guys doing the things they need to do. There needs to be some implementation in the contemporary now about this. And yeah, as a good Catholic, I'm not going to, recommend rape parties or anything, but like, there's some structure of, okay, so for instance, let's say 8 months ago, I was hanging out with a doctor buddy. We're at like a jazz club, getting drinks, having a good time. End of the evening happens. We go to a Waffle House, hanging out at the Waffle House. A group of young people come in, and I'm only like 30, so like young is like 20, right? Like, I'm not much older, but they come in, a
Hmm.
group, equal men, equal women, normally dressed, and I just start chatting with them about what they're up to. And these motherfuckers were doing urban exploration and active construction sites with rappelling
Hmm.
gear. And they have these hidden Instagrams where, like, I mean, I got on it, but they delete all their photos every day. So you get to see like a snapshot of them every once in a while. They're private,
Hmm.
so they have to have met you to get access to it. And they're just engaging in this truly exploratory, adventurous behavior that's incredibly attractive to the opposite sex and is like actually intriguing and fun and a worthwhile story. Like, just gathering these worthwhile stories and living a life that's full of worthwhile stories. And the older people are just supposed to open up enough connections and enough resources and really enough demonstration of habits where it's like, yeah, 90% of your time you're not doing wild shit. But, you know, in this 10% of things will help you make that happen. But in these 90% of boring living that everyone has to do since they're born, will help you get the habits and the jobs. And so you don't commit these dumb things. But if you explore a dangerous space, you go do that. Don't mention my name, whatever. Have fun out there. Don't get involved with the police. Maybe we can help you if we have people in the force, but like, don't be retarded. Like, if you're retarded, we'll disavow and we never knew you. But like, people have to engage with death, they have to engage with fear, they have to engage with what it means to be alive, like this vitality, this thumos, this like whole energetic that the BAP stuff kind of speaks to a little bit, like this pseudo criminality. Like, you have to take that on
Hmm.
because the entire like system that's operating against you is about constraint. It's about limiting, it's about measuring, it's about controlling, it's about holding everything in a specific pattern. And people that break the pattern are very valuable. But as a family man, you're building your own pattern, so you're very susceptible
Hmm.
to these regulatory controls. So like, there needs to be a way of helping the younger folk move into these dangerous positions and getting them off the fucking internet and getting them some pussy once in a while. Like, punk needs to return, and not the weird leftist punk, which is like the mainstay of what that archetype is. I agree, but more of like what the literature of cyberpunk is describing. Like, you're really learning, you have to be really capable, but you're really altering the universe around you. And part of that is self-selection. Like the filtration principles established by the inner circle are incredibly useful for the outer circle, because everyone is not aware when you're 19, like how to really filter out assholes correctly. And that's like not even just racially, like getting rid of everyone with the last name of Berg, right? Like there's deeper levels of filtration that have to be applied. And people just aren't aware of it when they're younger. And when you're older, it's completely obvious. So this is another domain in which you're helping them. But you have to like reward socially, like, oh, you built these drone things, you're engaging in drone racing, and maybe I can stick some like, explosive charges on that. Oh, that's super fucking based. Like helping, like with a child, like you're rewarding this sort of behavior of exploration and engagement and creativity, and like helping that move forward and setting the boundaries and being able to step in when like female politics begins to grow uncontrollable by the younger guys. That was always the big issue I have with religious groups, is the older people aren't involved at all. Like they're not there to like stop crazy women from taking total control of something and killing it off. Like there is a negotiation between inner and outer, but the outer has to be cultivated. And I think the internet and the normal endocrine disrupting patterns of today makes everything so quiet and so like lame and empty and liminal. And it's like, no, you have blood in your veins. Like you can do things. Like go do things, and we'll help you. Like we'll show you pathways if you want training in certain pathways. But like you have to choose something that's never been seen before.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree with this. One of the big things that I would say, oh, can you still hear me? Yeah, one of the big things that I would say early on is we live in a time where everything is very easy, right? And people might not feel that, right? People might say, oh, there's a lot of hardship and difficulty, but they're easy in the sense that like you can just sit in front of your TV and watch Netflix and drink beer and sit on your couch and like, yeah, you can get a job and it's like a cushy remote job and blah 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 blah, right? But in order to get challenged, you actually have to go out. You have to do things. You have to go to the gym and lift weights. You have to like go out and find ways to take risk and make things dangerous, right? Because you do live like we all live like have the opportunity to live a very cushy modern life. And I think kind of what I'm getting at with a lot of these things is, I respect the whole idea of, going out and, like being a mercenary or, being like a subversive where you're kind of like, like um, like my senior year, I wrote my thesis. In college, we had to write a thesis. And it's like usually 100+ pages that you're putting in over the course of like your last half year. And we went to we broke into the top of one of the famous lecture halls. We got onto the roof, me and a bunch of buddies from my crew team, and we smoked cigars. Right, it's kind of like celebrating, like submitting our senior thesis, and like that's kind of like a little bit more of a tame example, but like that kind of break the rules, do something outside the box. Like I think that's very healthy. You need to have the rebellious nature, right? It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with community and kids and how important it is that the kids have a good community because they are going to rebel against their parents. They need to. It's a healthy part of that experience. I think the point that I would stress is I think that whatever rebellion looks like for you, ideally as a parent, the thing that you can do is you can make the rebellion inside a sphere that is maybe seems high risk, or there's certain risks, but it's not as high a risk. Like I think that you're going
But
out and being a
what was rebellion historically? Like fucking a girl in the field because your parents didn't like that? Like this boomer Gen X, like contemporary liberal revolutionary attitude is not seen at all in human history. Like there is revolution, you can particulate it, and people are trying to do their own thing, but like you should probably be mostly concerned with helping your kids. And like the kids
yeah.
don't need to be at war with the family. And I think part of that is
Mm.
just like the boomers never set up the family. Like
Mhm.
there was nothing to really work towards. There was no, what do you call it, LLC that was established to transfer resources and like long-term objectives. It was like, well, you're 18, get the fuck out of here. you're 15 to 18, you know, you're going to be in high school in a hyper constrained environment, and I'm a fuddy duddy, so fuck me, right? Like everything is so lame, and we should be hyper revolutionary towards the lameness. But I think that's what happened. I think youth was just like the conditions of modernity are unsustainable, like at a blood
Mhm.
level is what was happening. I don't think that like youthful revolution is normal. Like people have always been talking shit about the youth, but it was always just talking shit. It was like, oh, you're dumb. Like it was never like, oh, you want to burn your family down. Like I don't have any historical references in any culture where like the youth were like the worst assholes on the planet like we have now.
Mhm. No, I think you're making a really good point. It's very similar in my mind to um, the the trad wife ideal. I had a really good conversation with I think it was Armchair Wanderer as his Twitter handle, but he made this really great point, and hopefully he makes this thread, and I'm not just stealing his thunder. But I was talking about the trad wife ideal, and he was like, "Well, keep in mind that the 1950s was a time of unprecedented wealth, and it was kind of like a social flex that your wife didn't have to do anything, and for
Yeah.
all of history." The vast majority of the time, the wife was actually like doing stuff. Was making clothing or candles or helping out in the field or whatever it is. But she wasn't sitting around idle, not doing anything. That isn't the ideal. That isn't what modern women should be doing, right? And it's part of the reason that that there is so much trouble with the idea of like the stay-at-home mom is not because it's like women rebelling against what is the natural feminine ideal. It's that women are rebelling against the idea of just being mothers and not having anything else like to do, right? Because that is not how it used to work. And I thought that was like such an important point because for the longest time I had kind of had this misconception that the trad wife ideal was what one should aspire to, and that also that would be fulfilling for women to just not have anything to do besides raising the family, and they could just focus full time on raising the family. But and I'd also kind of made the concession of like, oh, okay, well, it makes sense like that you'd want to have like a hobby, and I think that makes it's important and valuable, and like we have to be practical about how we do these things. But his point was like, no, 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 like you aren't being like practical and making some sort of concessions from the ideal. Like you are literally just misunderstanding what the ideal is, right? And I think that's kind of the same thing with childhood. Is like the boomer generation did such a bad job, kind of understanding what that was and what rebellion looks like and all this kind of stuff, that like even the ideals that we think are ideals aren't necessarily ideals, right? They might be like corner case scenarios of like, oh, you had the luxury to rebel against the family structure, and all this kind of stuff. And so, what does that look like? And so, yeah, your point might be well taken. I mean, I do think like the Roomspringer of the the Amish, where they like leave and they go try something else before they commit to being Amish. Like maybe that's a form of rebellion, but to some degree, what you're basically again, I think it comes back down to like you have to have that cohesive community, so the risk that you're taking, the exploration that you're allowing is still within safe boundaries, or if you can do that, that's a pretty strong
Rumspringa
thing.
is like such a perfect illustration of this because everyone confuses the Amish with the Mennonites. And the Mennonites are the true ultra Luddites, no technology at all. Whereas the Amish, you
Mm,
could formulate them more appropriately as diesel punk. Now, the Amish are having issues because of how successful they are with breeding, where there isn't enough economic baseline for them to operate. And so many of them have had to take on more technical jobs. So there's a fundamental problem the Amish are facing right now. But in recent years, an interesting domain similar to Rumspringa is the introduction of like online dating in between Amish communities to maximize the what do you call it, genetic variability. But the Rumspringer is so fascinating because that is a top-down structure. Like it's a cultural normativity of yeah, you guys need to see Sodom and Gomorrah. Like you need to be exposed to what it's like when you're on your own and engaging with this stuff and like what we have to really offer, and it's set from on high. And I think like parenthood and people that are forming these things should have the same attitude of like, you're essentially brainwashing your children, and that's good. Like you're setting the norms, you're setting descriptions and narratives of what human experience is, because we were all children once as well, and like we all had to experience what it was like when people gave us norms and didn't give us norms, and like what those boundaries look like. But they're limited by their mimesis, they're limited by their peers, they're limited by their experiences. So when they can see an alternative, they're like, oh, having a cohesive white community is fucking based. Like they need to have that experience and be shown that that's what it looks like compared to what the Great Babylon is offering. Like I think Rumspringa is probably the greatest articulation of it. And then also the mention of women in the tradwife context. This is the largest primary problem I have when I'm engaging with women and making stuff happen. Is while having friends as a man is super important, and networking as a man is super important, and it's a civilizing, really like world building activity. If your woman doesn't have friends, that is an extremely large problem. Like they're they're really built for like Camille Paglia talking about her like Italian ancestors and like all the women hanging out bitching all the time with each other. Like they require an environment where they can be hyper social. And if girls do not have friends or only have a few friends, it is always a huge problem. And like when you're finding a girl and making stuff happen, like it's almost secondary if you have friends. Like you should have friends, like just objectively, but like ultimately, if it's just going to be nuclear family energy and you're just trying to get a wife, make sure she's got friends. Because, like, I notice it in the Christian communities, it's really bad, Protestant or Catholic. You have like a massive gathering of youth and people talking and chatting and having a well established social ordering, and you don't even have to go do other stuff. This is what got me really bad is I used to just do Catholic things all the time. And I could spend 4, 5, 6, 7 days of the week doing just Catholic stuff and be totally fulfilled. But once people had kids, they essentially disappeared. Or even before, like once they got married, they disappeared. And then when you met with them, if they were your close friends and you hung out, they were just with each other. And so suddenly, two human beings, their entire social needs as a social animal are being met, not even really being met, but are attempted to being met by just each other. And it just leads to all sorts of problems and weird isolative effects. And it's like, you can still hang out with your friends, even if your friends don't have kids yet. And even those that do have kids, they don't maintain those close connections. It's really only the ultra traditional, like people doing Latin mass stuff, that are still hanging out together. Like there's this necessity of like you can have fun and be social and also still have children, but you need to recognize these sorts of what do you call it, limitations and difficulties of life, because people have jobs and they'll have children, they'll have things, and it's difficult to go out and all those sorts of things. Make sure that you've got a couple people in your immediate locality that you can spend time with. And maybe the internet can, interface for some of those things for some men, but for women, it's just impossible. And like as a man, if you're running the household, it's majorly important that your wife has friends. Like beyond like any degree that people I think are used to. Like she has to have friends, and you have to make sure that that happens. Even if those friends hate you, as long as they're not ultra libs, she has to have friends.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with this. I think that you know, one of the biggest misconceptions in the modern world is that a man should have his like deepest emotional relationship with his wife, and that she should be kind of the person that he can be the most honest, the most open, the most sincere with, right? Because you can't put all of that. First off, you can't put all of that on one person, right? But also, women typically they reflect the energy that you give them, and so if you have concerns, if you have doubts, if you have problems that you're going on, and you dump that onto your wife, right? Like that's not a good vibe for her. That's not healthy, right? And so you actually have to have some level of separation, right? There's things that you're just not going to talk to your wife about, which is like a really weird concept for a lot of guys in the modern world to hear, right? That you have to treat your wife. The game doesn't really end, right, so to speak. Um, and then the question becomes, okay, well, what is the alternative, right? Because a lot of guys are told, well, if you have a deep emotional relationship with another man, well, that's because you're secretly gay, don't you know? You know, and but that's not the case at all, right? Like this is why I'm so bullish on fraternal networks, right? Is because I think that that is something that needs to come back. We need sincerity. I mean, this is something you were talking about earlier. Is like there's a lot of irony, especially online, especially among the people I hate most, right? They kind of like, oh, I'm doing ironically, bros. Like I'm not saying to do it like actually, right? But it's authenticity, right? Like authenticity is what's going to win out because authenticity is direct. It's what we need right now as far as conveying information, getting people, connected and building these, fraternal networks so that we can then build businesses, right? Um, but it's male relationships. They need to get over the fact that the mainstream is going to make you. I remember when I was in Austin, I went to this concert, and one of the mainstream musicians had this song called what was it? All cowboys are secretly fond of each other, or something like that, right? And he had Willie Nelson come up, right? And then the whole idea of the song is like all the deep relationships that cowboys have are just because they're secretly gay, right? And it's just this fucking fallacy that's pushed in the mainstream, right? And it's the idea is like you are meant. It is meant to make it so that you can't have what is actually like an important, deep fraternal male relationships with your fellow men. Like when you have a problem, when you need a job, when you're stressed out, like the people you should be talking to are your male friends, right? And similarly for your wife is like, you don't like she shouldn't necessarily be like you should be able to like help her with stress and do sort of stuff. That's like part of it is your reaction to her stress should always be to minimize it. And that might sound dismissive, but the idea that the way that you communicate with a woman that her worrying isn't a big deal and that this is the way you have to communicate to them is to dismiss it, right? It's to be like, oh, that's silly. It's funny that you
Well,
think that.
also,
It's
you
funny that you
can't
worry about that.
possibly understand like pregnancy in the same way that other mothers can. And it's like
Mm,
you can accept the symptoms of pregnancy and help her with them. Like, there's nothing more wholesome than those videos of guys walking behind their wives and holding up their bosom or their belly when they're having trouble. Like, that's a great masculine response to pregnancy troubles. But we don't understand it at like a lived experience. And so they should have women that they can bitch to about how terrible it is to have this like horrible weight inside of them that's causing them to have all these weird hunger like responses. Like they should have people to talk to about it. And it's not us, it's somebody else.
yeah, no, I mean this is a good point. So anyway, like I said, I think that this has been a great conversation because we've hit on a lot of the ideas that I've been wanting to get out in some form of another to the timeline. Is also a lot of the conversations that I've been having at like the Weaver event, this is just in like the Portland area this past weekend. Just a lot of people are really starting to hone into this wavelength because I think what basically we all realize is, yeah, look, Trump won, right? We are on the verge of no longer having like DEI and the left censorship regime and all this kind of other things like breathing down our necks, right? We have the opportunity to kind of step out into the sunlight a little bit and get things done, right? It's like this like doxing isn't nearly as much of a thing, right? Like I've kind of put my face out there recently. Um, being out in North Carolina, like it made that a little bit easier, right? Because it's kind of hard for people to come at me for doing that. But the part of it is like we could all kind of sense a Trump win. We all understand that we need to like take these things offline into the real world and start building business. And so it was really great getting to talk about these things, like how do you bridge the gap, where things are going. I do want to kind of throw it over to you to kind of have the last word here on where you think things are going now that Trump has secured the White House. Maybe in the context of distributed defense distributed, but also just generally, like kind of your thoughts and kind of insights or like any advice you give to people, because that's a big thing that I always try to like to do with the cast here is try to leave people with some practical advice that they can apply themselves.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'll just a rejoinder, I'm not making black pill comments the way that a bunch of people are making black pill comments, during the election and over the past day of people trying to like gainsay or dismiss. I think that, Trump is, whether he's capable or not, he is at least wanting the enactment of a golden age. Like, I think that meme is excellent. It's true. You should be engaging on that. I'd say that what's most plausible and most likely, especially given the stock market engagement today, uh, there's going to be like a period of peace, like a period of stability of like things aren't happening every other day. Like you can just let life go and you can grow and you can engage on it. But like maybe there'll be some, pushback against immigration. I don't know if we're going to have Operation Wetback to Electric Boogaloo. It'd be really exciting. I'd love to be a part of it. But like, I don't know, even with Trump's improved lieutenants, if we're going to get this utopic like return of white America in such a strong, stringent response. Like, I don't think that he's going to represent that. I really want to see what Musk's work is and RFK. And actually, for those of you in the autistic agricultural know, Joel Salatin and Thomas Macy being involved in the Trump administration, like, there's some interesting stuff that could be done. But I'm a big fan of Uncle Ted. Like, I think that Theodore Kaczynski's commentaries and just reminding of people, and there's a variety of characters that have discussed this as well, in terms of you're in an industrial context, you're in a technical context. Like, there isn't like a tradition or a history that we can refer to that readjusts the level of problems that we have. Or like Marshall McLuhan discussing the global village, like in terms of mass communications and how this generates essentially tribal warfare at an extreme level. Like, we don't really have a lot of tools of our history to aid us in this regard. But I do think things will be relatively peaceful, which is good. It allows you to make primary decisions. It depends on where you're at in life. I would say those that have any resources at all should be engaging in the general biz dev environment, like Dime's work with Ad Church and elements like this, like the basics of the standard operating procedures of formulation of businesses, finding where supply and demand are open, even in the economy, and like trying to structure things that have more long-term valence. Defense distributed, we've always been short-term in our valence because we've always operated outside of the media context. We essentially do terrible, awful things that make news people very, very mad. And then they come and they talk to us. And then, we're part of the media cycle. But honestly, the long term stuff, if that can be stable and you can compound your interest and provide long term value, these are domains to explore. If you're a younger guy, and this is how it is with my brother who will be moving down to Texas soon, and my obligations to him, it's like get into the trades. Like, okay, I don't know if most people can remember. I don't know what the age demographics here are, but if I had to like redo everything from like 18 to 25, I would accept internally, you're retarded and you can't do anything. You don't know the context. You don't really know what you want. You don't know how you would get what you want. But wouldn't it be nice by the time that you solidify and actually can understand things if you had like a big bag of money and a nice skill set? Like electrician work and plumbing work for the next 10 years, demand is like estimated to increase like 20 to 30% year over year for those jobs. Like there is just some domains of the economy which are just obscenely valuable, and it's like you can have hobbies, you can have interests. In fact, most of the do-it-yourself firearm stuff, unless you're really a mechanical engineer, this is still like a hobbyist level interaction. And these people try to set up businesses and operate stuff so they can make a living, and it just doesn't really work out for them, and the margins aren't that good. And none of them think about it as just a long-term hobby. Like, oh, if I really want to approach this specific technical aesthetic problem to produce this specific firearm system, to achieve whatever goal I want to achieve. It might take 5 years part time to really do it correctly, but the scaling effects of getting it correct are extreme. Like once the plans and documentation and procedures are out there, then you can kind of teach anyone to make this crazy stuff you're doing instantaneously. And there is extremely wild stuff on the technical front. As just an aside, before we get back to just limiting what would be useful for DD and like what people do in the Trump era, uh, there are certain technologies that have come about in the past 6 months which are incredible. For instance, there's a guy on YouTube that has been using a kiln system in microwaves to process like iron. You can just take cut up iron plate and produce metallic components in like a silicon carbide mix. Very cheap casting with like a microwave. And metallic components, if you can get those at a precision level with some like Dremel work, you can have like very impressive technical stuff produced at home. Like there's a lot of really interesting things that are coming about. Like there's a huge new domain of interest. But if you consider it a hobby and you just sort of focus on like the primary engagement of making money, making connections with older males, finding interesting elements of self-selection, like for instance in Austin, there's like a UT grotto, underground Texas grotto, so like caving people. And that whole social orientation is very, very old school, and old school to the point that the older folks are like hippies. And remember, hippies are ultra right wing. Like there's a almost fascistic element to the social domination and interesting developments happening even in just that sub community. So make sure you're doing like cool stuff and
Oh
building
yeah.
up things. If Trump,
Mm.
descends from on high and determines that you're his guy and needs you to do something, yeah, jump on it. But I would just consider this period of time like the calm before the storm, because the Democrats are just reflective of a very strong regulatory technical society attempting to control every little facet of life and measure every little facet of life. And they want to destroy everything. It's what would you call it? A universal solvent. And I think that's from Daniel Dennett, who is a huge lib, but I think it's very descriptive of like individuated liberal politics, is just this like breaking down of all things. So just build up stuff and like find stuff to build up of. And I say that I, it sounds like Jewish almost in like arguing for just gathering money and going hard on nepotism. But I've been involved with characters where we've built like a 100-acre homestead farm down south of Boston. But there's very little we can do with it because the amount of capital at play. Like if we had 30 guys we trusted and could throw like $400,000 at a project, we could make a full Joel Salatin perfect super farm if we wanted. But it's sort of like two or three guys and like having to work all the time. So like even though we've had the opportunity to maintain this property and have like a retirement outpost, like resources are incredibly important. And like doing base stuff is important too, and being a part of things is important too. But like being able to build your own thing and have something to stabilize on, you have to throw yourself at it. It's not just like, oh, I believe this new thing, ergo life is better. It's like, no, I brought to bear an entire like energy to a problem, and I'm gathering everyone to solve that problem. And that's what connects you to history, is that's what everyone in the historical past was doing. They were just bringing energy to bear to solve problems. You're just in the same cycle. There's just a lot more complicated gay problems you have to face. And yeah, if
Yeah.
anyone wants to, send us any help or engagement, you can go to, let me see, I want to double check and see if that's the proper URL right now. Defense distributed. Nope, that's not it.
I think it's abbreviated. I searched it earlier on.
Yeah, it's defdist.org, DEFDIST.org. And so that'll be our different enterprises. You have DefCAD, where you have access to all of the 3D printable style armaments online. So there's thousands and thousands of files on there. There's Ghost Gunner, which is just sort of the milling platform, which is very interesting. And if you want to learn anything with Fusion 360 on CAD and CAM work, you can use it as a manufacturing platform to produce whatever you want. There's Ghost Guns, which is like selling the secondary components for firearm stuff, if you want to get into like kit guns. And then DD Legio is kind of the blog where it's like a membership page too, but it's mostly a blog detailing what the legal battles are. And in fact, I think most people, and this is where I want to be more involved in the right wing space, is just we are actively involved in lawfare for the past 10 years, and there's always things going on. Some of our leadership team was just in Pennsylvania a couple days ago, engaging in legal developments in the Third Circuit. So there's a consistent traction of stuff happening that's relatively occluded to people. But if people have ideas or you want to be involved or do anything with the company, don't reach out to me. Reach out to Cody, and you can do that at crw@defcad.com. Like he will check it, and like if you want to be involved or do something or know more, you can engage with him. Like I'm not the go-between. I don't limit you. Like I'm just a spokesman that's been involved for a while doing stuff. But Cody always happy to bring people involved, and then yeah, I don't know what Meta Prime's thing is, but if somebody reaches out in the Austin area and he feels like they're worth having, I'm always happy to meet up with people and bring them around to the shop and show how stuff is going.
I appreciate you making that offer. I do think that this is a great project. You know, when I kind of stumbled upon your stuff and we got introduced by our mutual friend, I was really excited to kind of hear all the stuff that you guys are doing, and you know, meeting you and like all the people kind of associated with that, right? Like it's one of those things where if there's a admirable thing to be doing, it's usually populated by a lot of really interesting people. And so yeah, Defense Distributed, go check them out if you haven't already. I mean, this is a really cool project in our space that I hadn't heard about previously. And so I've run into like a lot of the vet guys. So Clay Martin knows you guys and what you're doing. And so I've the guys who are kind of a little bit more in the know in this sphere, have a lot of respect for you guys and what you're doing. And so that's usually a really strong signal for me. But definitely, if you're listening to this, please check this out. I think great project, and it's cool. Like we're not like a giant Joe Rogan-esque podcast, and so the fact that you're willing to kind of make this offer, to the listeners who are kind of tuned in, if you're down in Austin, like that's cool opportunity. I hope some people take you up on it. But I really
Well, it's
appreciate
like
you coming on.
self-selection. Like who's going to be on here, right? Like I don't see a lot of black and women in here. Like what's going on?
Yes, we only have the most based and awesome followers, the Meta Prime account, and the MetaCast. So, yeah, we'll send some good people your way. But yeah, anything else you kind of want to promote before you go? I mean, I know we're kind of coming here without kind of encouraging people to just reach out to Cody. But anything else before we wrap up?
No, I'd say more broadly that the primary focus of life is be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. So seek impeccability.
Mm,
Know that your powers of perception are probably limited and you can expand them in a lot of different ways, but like just not being a huge asshole and just having fun. Like this is the Trump presidency. He's the clown par excellence. You can have fun. Like life is enjoyable. You can build things while having a giggle with your buddies. If you're not hanging out with people like laughing for like an hour straight with your friends, you're really not having a good time. Like, it
yeah.
sucks if you're in that position, and I would love to help you if I knew that, but like, you can just go out and have fun. Like, why else would you do anything? Like, just enjoy yourself. If there's technical, interesting projects to work on those, build yourself up, find your meaning. But like, you got to live every day. So have some fun and make sure you're doing everything right and appealing to your conscience and building up. Like, there's an ultra seriousness in the gun community, which is hard to get over. And the right wing community is a little bit better about it because of meme magic. But like,
Mm,
have a good time. Like this building up and extending and this leverage. This is all to extend good times to like your progeny. Like just
mm,
have fun. And if you're like engaging in essential, what do you call it? A degeneracy and like terrible, lame liberalism. And if you're living a Reddit tier existence, your life is not fun. Like those jokes don't hit. They're not enjoyable. They're punny at best. Like experience life, challenge yourself, stalk your sin, like fight, break things. And, we're here to help to the degree we can. We've just been fighting a battle by ourselves for too long. And the ideal is not for us to become the primary lodestone. The ideal is for everyone to fight. We don't care if we have the credit. We want everyone to fight. We're happy to help in this specific domain, but like, y'all should be fighting. All should be winning. You should be tired of winning.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I have a, this might be like a great little thing to end on, but a shout out to Gigathad. So he got engaged over the weekend, and actually I'd gone out and visited him. The and we did a bar crawl, and the last bar that we ended at was where he met his future wife. And I remember telling him, "This is the girl you're going to marry. She's awesome. You should go back every day with flowers until she agrees to marry you." And I'm very excited to give the speech at your wedding. I literally told him that night when he first met her, and so they're now engaged, and that's really exciting. But I remember he called me up. It was like 2 or 3 months in, and he was kind of like, just kind of like realizing like, oh, this is like a relationship, and there's this, it's not perfect, right? Like, it's like all relationships, you're always kind of like figuring things out. And I remember like the thing I told him was like, look, like, one, relationships aren't going to be perfect, but two, like, this very well this is probably your last ever romance, right? This is the last girl you will ever romance, right? This girl's going to be your wife, right, for life, right? Enjoy it, right? Like if I had the self-awareness, if I could go back in time and talk to myself at like times in the past, right? Mostly what I would do, right? It's not like you're gonna like shortcut the learning curve necessarily. Most of the advice I would give myself is just like, hey, enjoy the fact that this is going to be difficult, and that you get to learn this for the first time, and you get to figure this out, and you get to like go through the difficulty and the stress of like, struggling, but you're meeting people, you're working with interesting people, right? Like, that is like a cool thing, and I think we got like a very healthy dose of that during the Trump win last night. Just being around guys you kind of struggled with for a long time, right? Or in the group chats, and just like finally feeling like, hey, like we actually, like, things are good, things are going well, and things are looking up. And I think your message is well said. Like, kind of enjoy this, right? This is a rare opportunity. Life is a gift, and I think you show that appreciation by making the most of it, which is definitely living in the moment. So, um, awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on. This has been fantastic. It was funny, you're kind of telling me at the beginning, it's like, how long do you think this is going to go? And I was like, well, go anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. We ended up going for like 2 hours 45 minutes. We got a ton of views. This is great. Thanks everyone who tuned in. It was always great to see how many people show up for these. I think we have a very good group of people online who like to tune in and watch these things. And I was talking to some friends through the day, and they were like, "Oh yeah, 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 we're very excited to have you guys have a defense distributor on and stuff like that." So yeah, I'm excited to put this up on the Substack as well. So cool. Well, thanks again for coming out. I appreciate it. And yeah, hopefully we'll be in touch. There's a lot of stuff that we could be doing together, and hopefully you get some shout outs and some reach outs from this podcast.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, go with God, buddy.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and as I always like to say, it was never over, and we have never been more back. We'll catch you in the next one.